Hey, good morning, everyone. Nick Winkleman, Chief Operating Officer of Corpus Christi Water. This is our seventh Farfield Committee meeting, so thank you all for being here today. We appreciate the support and the input. And I know we've got a longer meeting scheduled today at the request of the committee, which is good. We appreciate that. There's a lot of material to cover, so with all that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Katya to get us started. And then I know Spiros has a lot of information to cover, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Katya Elizondo. I'm here in representation of Jose. You all know him. He will be here next week, but unfortunately, he couldn't be with us this meeting. So very quickly, the idea is that we just start and review the model calibration update and the scenario results. The review of the model calibration update is to review the current model calibration, the improvements, and the discussions from last week. The idea is that we take approximately 40 minutes, 20 minutes for Pradeep to present and explain everything, and 20 minutes for the questions. We're gonna try to be very, very mindful of the time, so we have time to really dive deep into the scenario results that we want to see today. So as you guys did last week, the idea is to let Pradeep present everything, hold the questions, write it down, or just in case you have something, so we can cover the model, the development, the data inputs, and after that we can discuss and open the floor. So the idea, first part, the review of the calibration, 40 minutes, 20 presentation, 20 questions approximately, and then the next 2 hours will be for the presentation and questions. So I appreciate everyone to be very concise, very direct, so we can go through everyone. The rules of engagement, you all have known them. The idea here, everyone will have their time to talk. We'll do the best to really follow it, have everyone respect the time, and, well, explain everything as clearly as possible. So with this in mind, we will jump now to Pradeep's presentation, and if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I just want to confirm for the people on the WebEx, is everything okay? Can you hear us? Please be mindful, keep your mute on, and raise your hand or interrupt when the questions are time for. So we're ready. Pradeep, I will give you the floor and the space. Thank you so much.
Okay, good morning, everybody. All right, so let's get going here. So today we're going to look at, we'll start with the model calibration update like Katya said here, and then we'll dive into the scenarios. So we'll pause for questions after the presentation of the, excuse me, calibration results here. So the main update in terms of the calibration, the issue we identified 2 weeks back was the model's underestimation of salinity within USSP, right? Everywhere else it was doing a pretty good job of matching the data. So we went back and took a hard look at what were some potential issues that we could improve in the model that would help bridge that gap in the salinity. So one of the things that we've presented in the past is that a lot of the model's open boundary, the ocean boundary, is based on baycast outputs, right? And so wherever we had data, we compared baycast, and it turns out that it's and also we had HIMOD, which is the ocean model, the broader Gulf-wide ocean model, not just the coastal model, that provides salinity estimates as well. So if you compare the two of them, baycast is always lower in terms of the boundary, in terms of the coastal salinity in the Corpus Christi area by about, not by much, by like 2 to 3 ppt or so. So what we decided to do was then, use high mod where we have high mod. And then where we don't have high mod, we'd fill in with baycast, but upscaled to a high mod, right? For the periods where they have paired data, you can calculate like sort of a correlation between them, and then you can upscale it. So that's what we did. We'll show a figure shortly that explains that. And then for the north and south boundaries, this is more or less what we did last time. It's some minor tweaks on the boundary condition. We do have partial data at two locations, like one on the north side. The Manor station provides boundary at the north side, and the Southport station provides salinities on the south side. So we use those to scale up baycast where we had, based on paired information. So those were the primary changes from what we had last week. Oh, and of course, the big one is in the bottom, right? So we also incorporated the dynamic salinity withdrawal and discharges. So now the model actually represents like inner harbor conditions real time for the intake of NBPS power plant, and then that salinity gets discharged into New Essex Bay. And then actually that helped too. Previously we were using a static boundary condition of 30 ppt, right? So it was always 30 ppt, but now it's it changes in real time essentially. So, and that actually did help with the salinity as well. So those are the main sort of updates in terms of the calibration itself. So if you can, we'll dive into the results here. So just on the salinity piece there, what this figure here shows are the raw baycast outputs. That's the bottom. So the top two panels there are the salinity for Packery Channel and the Aransas Pass, ocean boundary, essentially. In the middle panel there is for the northern boundary, and the bottom panel is for the southern boundary, right? So the gray lines in all of these are the actual unscaled raw baycast model output. And then the top line is, in the top two panels, we have high mod outputs, the green line, I think. I'm not able to tell the colors from here.
I think it's green.
It is green. And then the last part, where you see towards the end of 2024, that's when high mod stops. So that's the scaled baycast model output. It's scaled up based on the previous, the paired period where we have high mod and baycast. So for the most part, we have high mod and baycast paired, so it's a pretty good record of pairing them and scaling it up. And the middle and bottom panels, of course, it's baycast scaled up, but based on data, actual data where we had data. And so that's how we derived those. Okay, so as you can see here, this is important to highlight here that the baycast does underestimate salinities in the coastal part relative to high mod, and that was one of the issues too in the past. It's like, we were using the unscaled, the gray line as our boundary condition previously for the ocean boundary. And so that went up here based on the high mod, which is actually closer to 35 there. So, okay, so now we'll get into the results. I'm not going to go through the full suite of results that we went through in the interest of time. I'm going to focus on the areas where we needed improvement, which is really primarily New Essex Bay, and then we'll just briefly look at Inner Harbor to see, like, did anything change because of these changes? So, and we'll confirm like how the model is doing. So, what we presented I keep saying last week, 2 weeks back, was this blue line that was run 9. And then we had a partial run complete as well, like that we presented, where we switched from the USGS Mathis gauge to Calhoun gauge, right? So that's the Calhoun is closer to the New Essex River mouth and more representative of the freshwater flows coming in. So that itself was probably the biggest improvement in terms of like the salinity. But once we switched over to dynamic withdrawal and also updated our ocean boundary, now you can see that, that green line, which is our current run, so that's run 19 here, that pretty much tracks the salinity very closely throughout. Like the only place it starts to deviate is towards the end where we switch back to baycast. And so that's the only period, like, it sort of like deviates down a little bit. But it does a significantly better job of capturing, this rise, and then it stays with that, relatively consistent pattern that we see within Nueces Bay. Under the red. Oh, Nueces Bay CBI Salt 1. Oh, sorry, yeah.
See if I can move it.
Yeah. We're going to move it here so you can see it. Thank you. Yeah.
I think.
Thank you. Yeah, if you could move this one too, that'd be good. Yeah, there we go. Put that in the corner. Yeah, so this is CBI Salt 1 station. So that's sort of in the middle part of Nueces Bay, I think. Then we also have, but the top panel, of course, shows the water level between the model and data. Again, the water level differences between these three are very, very minuscule. Not a substantial difference between the three of them. And then the bottom panel temperatures, of course, like more or less the same predictions in temperature. So the changes to the ocean boundary salinity didn't really affect the temperature as much because baycast was already giving pretty good temperature outputs. It was the salinity that it was underestimating. Okay, so this figure shows the daily average of the, so you get to see that without all the tidal noise there. And you can see better here that on a daily average basis that it does line up with the data very closely here for the salinity and temperature. So the errors in salinity went down significantly. It was of the order of what, 7-ish before, 7, 8-ish before. Now we are at less, bias of like 1 or less PPT, 1.5 PPT or though. So it's like actually a significant improvement overall for the predictions in Nueces Bay. So this is at Salt 3, same story, right? So we were significantly this is where the underestimation was even more substantial because this was even closer to that freshwater boundary. And so you could see the boundary influence there. So as soon as we removed that freshwater, that itself caused a substantial improvement. You saw results through May, I think, May of 2023. 2 weeks back, that simulation completed, but then of course we subsequently improved it even more. So now the green line, which is our current run, lines up pretty closely with the data. Again, temperature-wise, no real issue. The model is doing a pretty good job of getting the temperature right, the seasonal dynamics, as well as the fluctuations that you see with changing weather patterns. There's the same information shown as daily average. The tidal noise removed. So again, significantly improved error statistics for Nueces Bay. So the last one is CBI NU185. I think this is closer to the shoreline, a little further north, I think. Oh, sorry, west. This doesn't have salinity data, but this gives you an idea of like actual difference between that pink and the green, right? So that's sort of the improvement we got by switching to that ocean boundary. So, and the dynamic discharge from, the NBPS power plant. Okay. So how did this change the conditions in the inner harbor? So this is the NOAA USS Lexington station. So again, the water levels really didn't change a whole lot. It's more or less, identical to what we had before, maybe with some subtle numerical differences. But you can see here, the differences in salinity predictions. So we're already pretty good, even with the around 9 that we presented, 2 weeks back. Again, there's no data here. This is just a model comparison at this point. You'll see the data comparison, the USGS one coming up. But this illustrates the differences in the previous model and the current model. It's important to note here that, when we fix the, some of those changes really don't propagate into the Inner Harbor and the Corpus Christi Bay proper. It's very Nueces Bay-centric change, but then the change to Bay gas propagates throughout, right? That's an ocean boundary. So that's why you see some differences here. So this actually shows a comparison to the data itself, and yeah, so you can see that we're actually doing even better on the Inner Harbor now at matching the USGS salinity data. Temperature-wise, not a substantial difference. It's more or less the same. The subtle positive bias that we had last week, that's still there in the model. But for the most part, it's like tracking the seasonalities well within the variability, both the diurnal and the seasonal variability. So, this is showing the same information as daily averages here. You can see that, with the tidal noise removed, the distinctions are even more apparent here. All right. Okay, so we also developed the depth profiles that we presented last week. Actually, these depth profiles, I don't have a comparison of before after. This is just the current one. So if you all can jot back to your memory, we were doing a decent job, but we were actually, this part, the data was relatively slightly lighter than the model in the last week. Now they actually line up even better, the salinity. So or rather it was the model was lighter than the data, and now the shades match even better because you saw that bump in salinity in the Inner Harbor, right, by 1 ppt or so. So now we're even closer to the data than we were before. And that's directly a result of that ocean boundary update that we made. Again, the temperature patterns, we really nail it, the seasonality of it. You saw that in the time series, and the depth profiles basically is reflecting that. There's not a whole lot of stratification that you see, but again, these are just a fixed point in time, right? That doesn't mean that it doesn't stratify in the Inner Harbor. It's just on the dates they sampled, it was not very stratified. Okay. Oh, my apologies.
It's pretty high, this salinity there, right? It's like, is it 30 to 35?
Brad, can you put your mic on?
Oh.
Yeah, I just get the number right, so it's about 35 or 40?
Yeah, so mostly here in this range here, from 30 to like 40, 30 to, yeah, about 30 to 35 for the most part. And it does drop down to like 30 at some time, like a little lower than 30, but mostly it's about 30. Yeah. And I should have pointed out that too, like, so this part here, the paler part is the winter cold temperatures, right? And the middle part here is darker, and that's the summer temperature. These are the brighter red colors. Yeah. I tried to do line styles in different, solids and dashed, but these are always a challenge to distinguish. Anyway, so just also confirmation that, farther out in locking the channel, we're doing, more or less like how we did before, maybe slight bump up in salinities because of that update to that ocean boundary. That's the only significant change farther out in Corpus Christi Bay and then, in other areas closer to the ocean, closer to the Gulf of Mexico. This again is the Texas Water Development Board location. We have some of the data here. Now we actually see that the model lines up with the data even better. And that predominantly had to do with that ocean boundary condition there. That gave it that bump that helped. So HIMART actually is a pretty good estimator of salinity for the ocean, that it turns out, than BayCast, even though BayCast is much more resolved spatially near the coast and calibrated to various locations. So, okay, let's see here. I think that's all. Okay, so that's all the calibration slides I have. So maybe we could take a pause here for any questions before we dive into the application.
So when you say you scaled up the simulated boundary conditions, you mean you kind of like had it match observed conditions?
No, so so let's go back to that slide here. I think it says what that scaling factor was, if we could read it, and I apologize for how small those fonts are. You know, they look great when you look on your screen. So-
Maybe you can zoom in.
Oh, maybe I could, yeah.
Like that.
Thank you. So, let's see here. So the raw baycast salinities are about 28.5 on average, right? And then the HICOM nearshore predictions were matched to the raw baycast output on a day-by-day basis. And then we compared like what that scaling factor needs to be so that we essentially, you know, well, when we had high mod, we used high mod. We didn't need to use baycast. The scaling really only applies for that last part in fall of 2024. And that's where we scaled it up. And the factor by which we scaled it up was about a 17% fixed factor, right? And so, which is not perfect, but you don't have data, you have to come up with a way to scale it up, right? And so that's what we came up with.
And so on the last model, did we use Baycast and HICOM for the boundary conditions, or was it more based on?
Primarily just Baycast, it was using the gray line, I think, so. For the north and south boundary, we did scale it up similarly with the observations. That was done even before. But for the ocean boundary, we don't have any data to scale it up, right? We could have just stuck with a high mod, but we didn't think it was actually this different in some periods. Like some periods it's actually very close, as you can see here. Some periods it is off. It is a very, you know, Amin's on the call, on the line. He was closely involved in developing and validating that models. He can probably speak more to the Baycast's overall predictive capability. Overall, my understanding is that it's a pretty accurate model for the coast. It just so happens to be like right at our boundaries. It's a little underestimating the conditions a little bit.
Cool, thanks.
I have a quick question. So HICOM is a model that is really developed for deep water circulation, not so much shelf. I can't remember if it incorporates freshwater inflow along the coast.
I actually don't know the details. It does provide a depth-based prediction, like it provides a vertical profile of salinity. And by looking at it, you know, like you can't really, the gradients were not appreciable. So it was relatively consistent near the
Yeah, because
shore.
I mean, we have seen lower salinities in the near shore compared to the offshore. Basically, the influence of the Mississippi that during certain times of year, the transport is down coast, so we see it here.
Yeah.
It's a good model. It's a very good model, but it's not necessarily a coastal model. That's why.
Yeah, which is why we used Baycast to begin with, right? That is the coastal model. We thought that'd be more accurate, reflecting all that fresh water, but it just happens to underestimate our salinity, or we think it underestimates our salinity. We don't have data there, so we cannot corroborate that one way or the other.
Well, there is the National Estuarine Research Reserve water quality station at the ship channel, which I've mentioned several times, and that one has salinity measurements continuously. So that's one thing that you could compare.
Okay.
Those data are already downloadable.
I think maybe Jason and Sharon get what you did, but I'm still a little confused. I was wondering if you could kind of put this in layman's terms, how you took the modeled ocean salinities and how that then was used to adjust the EFDC modeled salinities. Just give it to me high level. I'm sorry, but I
Yeah,
don't
no
understand
problem,
what you
of
did.
course. So the model, at the edge of the model, you have to tell the model what the conditions are, right? Like you do that for the pressure boundary, the water level, you do the same for temperature, and you do the same for salinity. We have imperfect information at the boundary for salinity. We have good temperature data, we have good, water level data, because those are, we have good high frequency data for those. So we took the estimates of baycast initially, that's what we were using before, and used that at the ocean boundary. Whatever the model, the baycast model predicted at that ocean segment, those grid cells in that bigger model. So we did the same for HIMOD, right? So HIMOD is another model, like you get, those grid cells are bigger in HIMOD because it's a Gulf-wide model, not just for a coastal model. So you had to get the near shelf segments of HIMOD and then pull those outputs from that model, right? And so that's what that top line in that figure shows. So now we're telling our EFDC model, hey, we have an estimate of what that salinity is when you get to that edge of our model domain. And that's that top line. And where we didn't have that HIMOD predictions, then we had to we have to patch it up for that last period in 2024, right? So what we did, we essentially scaled the baycast outputs by 17%. If you line them up, that was roughly the difference needed to get baycast to as close as HIMOD as we could. And that's how we scaled up that ocean boundary for that last, fall of 2024.
So if you were to run this model in different years, would you still use that sort of correction factor then? If you only had baycast, for example, would you just?
Yeah, because if there is specific data, we could probably scale it up again for those using those data, and to the extent that it may, but it's available and relevant for that location. If not, this would be one way to do it. We have paired predictions of the two, and then we are assuming that when you project it out to another period, that 17% fixed correction factor holds. You can do other fancy correction factors like seasonalities and so on. But if you really look at the salinity range in HIMOD, right, it's not that variable, and that goes back, to Dr. Herska's point, there are maybe freshwater events that's causing that salinity in baycast to dip. So maybe that is real, but we do not know that, right? And so that's something that, you can look at. But the proof is in the pudding on this, right? If that freshwater signal is coming into the bay all the way, you'd see that in the USGS salinity data, right? And so, so to me, if the boundary conditions are wrong, we would overall, the model would underestimate salinities everywhere, and that's not happening, so.
So, the last meeting, you showed us the data. It looked like Nueces Bay was really the location where there needed to be some adjustments. And it sounds like what you're saying is with just correcting this ocean forcing, that has basically brought us where we need to be with regard to Nueces Bay salinity.
Yeah, so the ocean boundary gave us maybe a 2 ppt bump. The biggest improvement in Nueces Bay came from the correction to the freshwater inflow itself. We were overestimating the freshwater inflow.
Gotcha.
That was the biggest improvement, right?
Okay.
So it was already there. We showed these results halfway through, maybe up to May or so of 2023. That simulation was still ongoing, so I couldn't present it, the full simulation 2 weeks back. So this improvement was already achieved even before we corrected the ocean boundary. So from here to here, that's the bump that we got from the ocean boundary. And this change you actually got everywhere, right? You see that difference even in other locations. So that, I think, so overall, I think, it's, the ocean boundary had some effect. It helped us in some locations, including Nueces Bay. The freshwater inflow was the biggest factor that actually helped fix that.
Brad, you had a question, you raised your hand?
It's kind of related. I was wondering about, from a physics standpoint, so you can go in and, well, I'll try modifying a diffusion coefficient. There's many variables that you could do to try to get it to match. And I guess you've kind of answered, but I'll put it this way. What led you to look at the ocean boundary? Was there, well, let's try this, or did you have some intuition to say, I think this might be?
Well, you look at all factors, right? Like, the first thing that you want to fix in a model is a boundary condition, right? Like the less degrees of freedom you take for calibration, the better it is. If you get your boundaries right, your bathymetry right, the physics in salinity is mostly a tracer. It should take care of itself for the most part. And whereas if it's a biology, then that's a different story altogether, right? Like it's much more complicated to get the biochemical reactions and, if you're trying to predict primary production, for example, and DO, which is related to that, those are extremely complicated. And but salinity, for all practical purposes, is a tracer. It's a balance of fresh water and salt water.
Yeah, so I think the proof is in that spatially this works. I think I mentioned on email, one of my thoughts I'd heard in reports that wind could affect and did affect Nueces Bay pretty strongly. So when we were looking at Nueces Bay, I thought, well, maybe this is happening. And some people I know that live up there, and they say, it's always driving in their experience of people that live there. So, but this would say, I guess, again, coming back, I was concerned about one change of a linear 1.17 to everything. Did that, I guess the proof in the pudding is that it worked throughout Corpus Christi Bay and the other locations to get this disparity line down.
Yeah.
So I think you answered my questions, but I just wanted to ferret out it's usually important, the three legs of not just tuning knobs, but was there a physics basis for that intuition?
Yeah, the physics basis was like the salt balance is off, right? Clearly. And so and we're trying to get that salt balance right in with the new SSB.
Right.
Yeah. And also one other aspect of it I'll mention is like, and it's probably important and it's not apparent here, the dynamic withdrawal from the inner harbor and release into Nueces Bay for the power plant. We didn't have that in the.
Oh, okay.
So that is also incorporated now. So previously we just had a static 30 ppt discharge for the Nueces Bay power plant. But now if you actually look at the, so here, right, so roughly it's actually coming at closer to 34 or 35, right? So you have the power plant discharge was coming in at 30 before, but now it's actually time variable and it's actually reflecting the conditions in the inner. So that I'm sure that helped too. I've not done a detailed comparison. It's a combination of all of these factors that cause that improvement in Nueces Bay.
And just one quick clarification, when we're looking at comparison, is that what's labeled run 9, what you had before?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Otherwise, we can have more time and discuss the scenarios next. Okay.
Has there been any enhancements to the vertical grid resolution inside the inner harbor?
The models, we have not changed the vertical resolution from what we had before. It's the same.
So it's the same as the ports model or previous?
It's the same as what we had 2 weeks back.
It's the same as, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any additional questions? No? Well, Pradeep, you can go on. The same dynamic, we will let Pradeep talk about the scenarios, complete the presentation, and then we'll open the floor. Hopefully we'll have time. The idea is that at least 1 hour for questions, so no worries, we'll have enough time for discussion, so thank you.
Yeah, and so I'll note that it's going to be very dense, no pun intended. We're going to be talking a lot about density, and the presentation is going to have a lot of different figures and lots of difference comparisons. And I'll say ahead of time, if you're lost in some of those and it's important that you track what I'm saying in those. So if it is completely I have no idea what you're saying there, please do stop me. But if it's more oh, did you try this? Did you try that? Let's maybe have that discussion in the end, right? So, and I want to, even I was reading through this when I was putting the slides together. It's oh, this is a lot of material to get through, and people may get lost as we go through that. So I just want to say that ahead of time. So if you're I have no idea what that means, just stop me so that we can, I'll go over that again. Okay. All right. So let's get going. So our original plan for the the modeling scenarios, and that still is the plan, is to finish what our mod 1, our mod 2s and 3s were, right? To simulate it for existing condition without, ship traffic, and then simulate it with ship traffic, with and without desalination discharge. Then we received the committee's request for a series of scenarios, and then, one of the requests that you all had was, if you can prioritize one, do the hypothetical worst case. So we got that through. So that is also completed. So we'll present results on that too today. So essentially for the base, for the existing conditions, it's relatively straightforward, right? So whatever you saw as the validation in the previous slides, the run 19, without that's our existing condition simulation. Then all we did was we added the desalination plant's intake and return, right, at the permitted capacities. And it is dynamic, and so we so it will, similar to New Esses Bay, it'll reflect the changing conditions, and it'll always, EFDC will always reflect the changing conditions in the intake. It's the return that needs to be sensitive to what it's pulling out, right? So that's the dynamic discharge component of it that's been added to the model. So that part is done. We'll go through the results. That's the one we'll spend a lot of time on, and then we'll go through the hypothetical worst case, which is essentially the same set of figures, but we'll focus on ones that are more meaningful in terms of what are those differences. So for the hypothetical worst case, the way we set that up, I think the request was 1.2 degrees Celsius temperature increase at the ocean boundaries, and then 120 millimeter sea level rise. So essentially higher water level and warmer water coming in, right? We didn't change the salinity. We zeroed out New Esses River flow. So the flows were completely zero. So no freshwater inflow from New Esses River. We added CC polymer desalination discharge, and this was, the assumption we made here is that the water right will be fully utilized, and that there'll be 50% recovery of fresh water, right? So it's a consumptive use of 50%, right? So you have half the flow, which means that you're doubling the concentration of the salt coming in. We also removed OSO facility discharge and Allison facility discharge, right? And so, although, my understanding, Nick, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, we kept that in here for the purpose of the request. The only thing we didn't add here was the 10th percentile wind. To me, it's pretty unrealistic to have 10th percentile wind for 2 years. That's very calm conditions for 2 continuous years, so we didn't include that. Well, what we can do, and we'll come to this in the end, we can look at our wind draw sets and then, maybe identify periods where things are calm, and then we can, narrow down the results for those periods from both of these simulations, both sets of simulations.
And Pradeep, there were minimum discharges that also in Allison planned.
For the simulation, I just removed it completely.
Because it's worst case.
Yeah, it's the worst case, yeah. So it is hypothetical, we all acknowledge that, it's unlikely that all these combination of factors will be true at once, but it does push the system considerably. So.
Well, with OSO and Allison being transferred into the industries, wouldn't some of that flow then end up into the ship channel?
Possibly, yes.
It would. We do need to remember there's that's not additional water for them, because they're offsetting their take of the potable water.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, thank you. Also on CC Polymer, don't they have a discharge permit?
Yeah, they do.
So why not use that instead of just assuming the 50%?
So the discharge permit flows higher than their water rights, and I didn't have information on how much desalination they actually do, so I just wanted to, assume whatever they took for consumption.
It's my understanding that somebody could correct me, but the CC Polymers was not going to desalinate to drinking water standards. They were going to desalinate enough for their industrial purposes, and then there was a secondary smaller desal plant for their potable water needs. That was my memory of that permit.
That's correct. Also, their discharge permit calls for the return of the wastewater from the plant into the waste stream. So it's not a 50%. And I don't know how much they lose to evaporation, but that's why that looks weird compared to the other ones, because it's not potable and it's not for off-site transfer.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. So of course, CC Polymers is through Aquatech negotiating with the city on purchase of the water, so that operation may change. To David Loeb's point, the discharge from they can treat the water for potable purposes and discharge it, but if they're discharging from the manufacturing facility, they absolutely have to have the brine with it for that facility to even operate. Yeah, that's part of their discharge permit. But all of those things, it's all being reworked and it's sort of in flux. So Pradeep, I can get you more, because we just received some information from them this week. I can share that with you.
Okay.
And maybe that would provide more guidance, but at the end of the day, CC Polymers, it's not confirmed. I mean, we still don't know when it may or may not ever come online. We just don't know yet. Good points.
Salt balance is different for potable and not potable. It's not materially different.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the clarifications there. I think that one I just had to make an educated guess of like, in the interest of getting things done for this meeting, but we can certainly refine if something needs refinement. Okay, so for the purposes of this presentation, so I'm going to use the locations that Sharon provided right in the bay. So these are all the different locations within the Inner Harbor, the Ship Channel, Nueces Bay, and then going out, farther out into Corpus Christi Bay and one in Redfish Bay, right? So there's a lot of locations, so we'll go through it in some detail for some of them, a subset of them, to get a flavor for what does it look like in the Ship Channel versus the open, shallow waters versus deep water. And then, of course, eventually we can, we'll have all of these in our reports for all of these locations. We'll publish the results. So the way we took a look at this was to essentially start with, salinity and density really are the two components here, right, for the concern on stratification. I mean, temperature has an impact on stratification, but for the purpose of this discussion, it's really these two. So a lot of the focus is on salinity and density, the way the presentation is. We will show time series of temperatures so you get a flavor for how, if at all, temperature changes. But mostly the comparisons are going to be on, the differences for salinity. Then we'll look at depth profiles of both salinity and density at the deeper locations, where it's more meaningful to construct these depth profiles. And these were constructed for some specific tidal windows, and I'll explain how we picked them in the next slide or so. And then I think the stratification itself was estimated as, just as a first cut, the bottom salinity minus the surface salinity at each of these locations. And then we also calculated density at each of these locations using the UNESCO equation, which is a function of both salinity and temperature. They both go into the calculation of density, model predicted temperatures, so it's model predicted salinities. And then we similarly take the bottom density and the surface density, and then we subtract the two out to get a measure of stratification, right? So that's for each of the simulations by themselves, without desal and with desal. Now, the interesting part is, how does that change between the two, right? If you have a certain level of stratification under existing conditions with desal discharge, how does that change? So there is that difference piece as well. So it's a difference of differences. It's second derivative of the stratification, right? So, or second derivative of salinity and density. So, so we'll look at that when we get there. And again, I'll explain this one more time because it's a lot of differencing going on and you know, so it'll be hard to track in the sign conventions and everything that comes through. So, okay, so for the purpose of developing vertical profiles, you know, and we said like we'll look at the tidal cycles, the spring neap cycles, and pick periods in the tides where you have freshwater inflow, where you don't have freshwater inflow, where the tidal amplitude is at its maximum, so you have the highest tidal energy for pushing it one way or the other. That's sort of the basis here. So what you're seeing here is, so this is for 2023. We did for 2023 because it actually lined up quite nicely with freshwater inflow in dry, but we could also pick another period in 2024, but you know, we have the full results. So if there is an interest in looking at specific profiles in other times of the year, we can do that too. So this period here is, you know, this has the highest tidal amplitude in the year, so that's sort of the second line there. I'm actually going to zoom in so I can read, sorry. So the second line is the spring cycle, so here's the neap tide and then the spring tide. And what we did here was for the neap condition, that's, you know, the tides are weaker there, and we also took the low water. So this is when you'll have the most energy for that brine to come out of the inner harbor, right? Or rather, not energy, but more like, you know, so there's less forcing from the ocean to stop it, but keep it in the inner harbor so it'll come out. The opposite flip side of that is when you have high tidal amplitude and high energy, that's another way it can mix and come out too, and that's the spring cycle. So you take the high water and conditions leading up to that high water during that spring tide, and that's when the brine's gonna get pushed in, and then like it comes out, then you have a lot more energy for that to mix and also come out. So between these two, we're kind of enveloping the different sort of energy regimes that we'll face within each tidal cycle, right? And the reason we picked this date here is because, you know, this has the highest tidal amplitude, which means that the most energy fluctuations that you're gonna have from the tides. And also this is a period with a pretty decent amount of Nueces River flow. This was when the releases were still happening, right? So there's fresh water inflow into the system. So we picked a second period here, similarly. This is in summer of 2023. So August 28th, so this, you know, so right here is the new moon. And right before that new moon, you can see the tidal cycles, the spring cycle start, and then the neap comes a little later here. But this period coincides also with relatively high tidal amplitudes, but no freshwater inflow, almost no freshwater inflow here. Sorry, this one is the Nueces River flow in CFS. So that's kind of the rationale for picking these. Now this is just, you know, we're going to present results for the full time series, all the differences and everything will be for the entire 2 years. This is relevant for the depth profile analysis, where we took a very detailed look at the depth profiles. It's not like we only looked at this period, but this is just context for the depth profiles and you know, some of the specific analyses that we did. Okay. So now the trick is to go back to the correct size. Oh. I'm just going to start there. There we go. So this is just to give you a big picture view of how things changed. This is from the summer, so this isn't on neither of those tidal windows, but the reason I picked this one was because, sorry, I'll get back to that in a minute. I just wanted to show something here. So it starts on July 1, and so July 1 is when you still have freshwater inflow, so it transitions from this freshwater inflow period and goes to August into this dry period. So I wanted to also show the transition. So that's why I picked that period for that one, and the animation. There are a few animations, but that's the only spatial animation we're going to show today. Okay, so before I start this animation, so just a caveat throughout this, we're still doing quality control on all of this. This work is just hot off the presses. These results are like 2-3 days old. We're still digesting it. So just keep in mind that, you know, as we work through this something could change, or if we have like, perhaps like a CCP polymer should be like this, then, we may rerun the model. So keep that in mind, but for the most part, I think, this should be reflective of the actual conditions and predictions of the model. So this animation is going to show salinity. So the blue here is what, 20-ish to 40, I think, red. And then the pale colors are roughly, seawater salinity, right? Like a little lower than seawater salinity. Is that what, okay, thank you.
Before you hit play, how these animations relate to the last two things you said, because for the model application, you mentioned that for this worst case scenario without desalination, there won't be any freshwater inflow from Nueces Bay. But then in the previous slide, you had some inflow, like at the beginning.
Oh, thanks for that question. This is, so we're looking at two sets of results. One is the existing condition as it is, not the hypothetical worst case. So existing condition as it is, without ship traffic, we need to add that is ongoing, and then with and without desal, right? So this is our sort of realistic, conservative existing conditions without, accounting for ship traffic, which would mix that. So this is more like a realistic condition that is as it is today. And then the hypothetical worst case is a future-based environmental scenario to say, like, if conditions change, then how would that discharge affect the conditions from the brine discharge, right? So yeah, so what we're looking at here is the existing condition. And so thanks for that question. The left side is the RON 19, I should have put a label on that one. So RON 19 is the current condition without desalination discharge. The right side is with desalination discharge. And so what you're seeing here is at the start of the period, this already reflects operations for what, like this is July 1st, so this is about 6 months, half a year of discharge has already happened. And this is just midway between that simulation. So it's worth noting some similarities and maybe also some differences. For the most part, the color patterns are not that different here at the start. But you do notice, like, maybe if you pay attention to this part in Nueces Bay, you'll see like it gets a little darker with the tides. As the tides go out, you'll see like slight darkening of that. I just want to point that out before I play that so you can pay attention to these things. It's really difficult to tell what happens in the harbor from this. That's not the intent of this. This is to show more a holistic picture. We are going to have some very detailed, profile comparisons within the harbor where you'll get that idea of like what's happening in the harbor. Okay, so we'll go ahead and play this. So this, I think it's about 4 frames per second. So bear with me for maybe a minute here, maybe 30 seconds. We'll see how long it goes. So you can see here that the tidal, forcing like where you'll see the salinity push in and out of Nueces Bay, salinity push in and out of Oso Bay, and Laguna Madre. So you're also seeing higher, salinities in Laguna Madre. Partly, the observations support that too, right? If you look at the Southbird Station, you'll see like some pretty high salinities there. There's a lot of evaporative loss. It's very shallow. And then, yes, in Nueces Bay, now you see that freshwater signals. Sorry, I should have pointed that out. So let me go back here for a second. So here you see that there is freshwater signal early on in the simulation, right? So this is when that freshwater Nueces River discharge was still coming. And when that goes down, you're seeing that this starts to get paler and paler, closer to the ocean salinity. So I think we paused right about here. So I'm going to start here again.
And this is as we get into the drier.
Yeah, so there that flow's dropped off, yep. And then, yeah, so like I said, this if you really squint, you can see that this area is maybe a hair darker, and you'll see that in the time series much more clearly. That's why I don't like animations, because you always have to squint and look at things in real time. It's a challenge to pick things up. But it does show the overall circulation patterns going in and out. Like, are there any fundamental shifts is what I was looking for in this. And generally no is the answer. Okay, so that's the current condition. I didn't run this animation for the hypothetical worst case, but you'll get a pretty good idea of what those look like from the other figures that we're going to look at. But I just wanted to give this holistic picture here to say, like, how does this change with and without freshwater inflow? Do we see, any appreciable circulation differences in circulation patterns?
Sorry, I was just gonna point out that Redfish Bay is mislabeled up there.
Pardon me, say that again?
Sorry, Redfish Bay, it's not in the right location.
That's looking to channel. What's labeled Redfish Bay.
Oh, I see, so.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I didn't even catch. Oh, yeah, thanks for catching that. We'll fix that. Yes, Redfish Bay is farther out here to the right. It's not even showing in the frame here. Yeah, we'll fix that. I think the lat long must have gotten crossed there. Yep.
So there's no plume of doom?
Pardon me?
Where's the plume of doom?
Well, nothing obvious. And, you're not seeing like doubling of salinity, right? If that's what you're looking for, that didn't happen.
I was promised the plume of doom.
I think we need to look at the point data and vertical profiles
Yeah.
with the resolution of the values, and we can actually look at the salinity increase like you're gonna show before talking about what the outcome really is.
Yeah, we're gonna look at all of those, it's coming up, so. All right, so let's go to the next one. So let's start with the inner harbor locations, right? So we're gonna look at Vela Basin all the way up, the central part of the inner harbor, and then right at the harbor mouth. So we'll start with, time series. Actually, they're right here. So I'm going to open a series of PDFs here. We'll switch between the PDFs and the PowerPoint. It's a lot easier to organize it this way than looking at a presentation. Okay, so we're going from the mouth of the harbor in. So keep in mind this is downstream of the discharge. Well, ocean side of the discharge. Whether it's downstream depends on how much flow we have and what the tidal phase is. What these figures are showing, and I'm going to zoom in here let's see. Where's the handle? There we go. So the red line, the solid lines first. All the solid lines go with the existing condition, and the dashed lines go with decel. Okay, and then the red, blue, and green here. So the red is the surface, blue is the bottom, and the green is the depth average. So these are actual model predictions of salinity and temperature, and densities calculated from salinity and temperature based on the outputs for the surface and bottom. Okay, so top panel here is showing the salinity at the outer inner harbor. So to Dr. Hershka's point, there are differences, right? So you can see here the dashed line, that's the bottom salinity, and this is the solid line, so that's without the desal. So you do see in the bottom, there are increases in salinity. So if you look at the scale, that's of the order of 1 to 1.5 ppt. And you'll see this in the difference plots as well. But I want to point that out here that, that's where those differences actually happen. In the surface, not as much, right? They're about more or less the same throughout. There are some periods where there's a little bit of separation that you see, but the other important part to note here is that these are not, there are sustained periods where there is a difference here, but there are also periods where it actually merges together, meaning like it does mix up. So those it's not like there's a brine plume completely isolated from the tides. It is still participating in the tides, but it just takes time before it mixes, right? And that's where you see all three, there is no difference at all, so that probably is a very strong tide coming in and pulling them out and mixing them in. So these events periodically set up and I want to say that this is a spring neap cycle signal that you're seeing here. I wanted to put the tides on this, couldn't get to it in time, but we'll try to do that in our final report to have that. So I wanted to basically put the tides on this, on the y-axis, so you can see like which tidal phase you're at, essentially run a garden filter or some kind of a tidal filter so that you can see the spring deep signal in the water levels. So we'll do that, but so there is definitely sort of a 2-week-ish signal that you can see where it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and so. All right, so temperature, actually the temperature was pretty boring. It's not that different, and you don't really see a whole lot of, like they're basically like very close to each other for the most part. So really the driver of your density is going to be your salinity here, and temperature is not as substantially different. So the density, so let's look at this here in some detail. So these are in kilograms per cubic meter. It's 1 grams per cc, 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter, roughly. Sorry, go ahead.
Can you just, at the bottom has the legend where it says what the red, green, and blue, and you just keep going over that real quick?
Yeah.
I'd just like to take a look at that for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. So the red is the surface, the blue is the bottom, and the green is the depth average. And then the solid lines are without the desal discharge, and the dashed lines are with the desal discharge. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and there are going to be a lot more colors too, and we're all going to be like tested on our color, distinguishing colors today. So.
And poor Brad, he's colorful.
I tried to do the dashed lines, but these things, it's really. Yeah. In the difference plot, some of them I tried to add some shading and stuff so we can tell which is the differences, but it's always a challenge to present these many number of lines on a single panel.
Can you zoom in to the part where on the top salinity where it's the greatest variant, like where you have the dotted blue line at the top and then the red jaggedy line at the bottom, more to the right? And so what's the time period of the whole scale there?
So this is 2 years.
Okay.
So this goes from roughly the beginning of 2023 to the end of 2024.
And so one of those peaks, how is that like a month or a week or a day or what?
Yeah,
What
so
kinda
each
makes the
of these sticks is roughly, each of these is exactly a month. So the little tick in between that you see here, so this is a month. So half of this is one spring neap cycle, roughly.
So when you go back up to the salinity and you go to the thing with the greatest variation, where the blue is way up high there, that's about a week then of a little arc of blues. That would mean that the salinity has gone way up for a week.
Yeah, about 1.5 ppt or so, yes.
And that's with desalination.
With desalination, correct. You actually, there's another figure coming up that will illustrate that a lot better. So we don't have to squint on this. The actual differences, the next plot that I'm going to show will show the differences. And it'll make that very clear what that difference is. This is more to show the long-term pattern on what it looks like, in general. Like, do we see, in this figure, what we were looking for is like, are you seeing this separate out and then stay distinctly different? Like, are you seeing completely different salinity regime, right?
Excuse me, Pradeep. Deanna, did you have a question?
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I did. Actually, before you went to the next slide, I had a question on the animation. You said it was in real time, but it does not include the ship channel and wind velocity. Is that correct?
It includes the wind velocities, yes.
But not ship channel?
It doesn't. These set of simulations do not include the ship traffic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so it's in real time, but it's not in actual real life. Is that correct?
Well, it is it is as close, it's a conservative estimate of real life currently, right? So that, and we're working on putting the ship traffic in, and that's hopefully will be done by next week, and we'll be able to present those results to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right, it does, so it actually underestimates mixing, right? So it overestimates potentially like stratification. So that's an important point to keep in mind. Okay, so this is at the Outer Harbor, and so what the next set of plots that I'll show here, so we're still in the Outer Harbor. Now here, we're looking at the difference, exactly the question you were asking, Carrie, in the last one. It's like, what is the difference? So this one is actually showing us that difference between with and without. So now we've reduced 6 lines to 3 lines, right? So the blue is, again, your depth average, the bottom. Red is your surface, and the green is the depth average. So those are the differences of the corresponding lines in the previous figure. So here, again, the main thing to note here is the change in scale to show those differences, and also you have negative and positive values, right? Because sometimes with desal is higher, sometimes it is lower, and they bounce around, right? And that's basically what you're seeing here. So to keep things simple, we're really just for the difference plots, we're focusing on density and salinity. Keep in mind that temperature is integrated into density, so we're indirectly also looking at temperature, but really the biggest driver of density is going to be our salinity, right? And you can see some parallels in those patterns too, but there are also, it goes up and down, it bounces around the 0 line in all 3 depths. So the magnitude of the salinity increases anywhere between, if you ignore this isolated one, to some numeric tidal facing, I would say about -0.2 to 0.3 to about like 1.5 to maybe 2 in very rare instances. The duration part, which we'll get to in the next figure, and which is what your point was, like, it's not just one day, right? It can be extended, and that's important from a biological perspective, right? So if you have like so in the Clean Water Act, that's why you have a duration, magnitude, and frequency, right? So all 3 components are important when they set regulatory standards. Now, as far as I know, there is no salinity standard here in Texas. So, but I just wanted to capture that duration, and we'll see that in the next figure that I'll have like an average over duration.
I forgot what you said about the CC polymers, whether or not, once that's in operation, is the effects of the salinity from CC polymers added into this already or not?
No. This one is just the existing condition. We will look at that in the hypothetical scenarios where the CC polymer is added in and all the other critical conditions are added in.
How many million gallons per day is this for the desal output?
Was it 35 CFS, I think is the water right? If I remember correctly off the top of my head.
Jessica, what was the question?
For the desal simulation, how many million gallons per day of desal brine is this modeling using?
Oh, so you mean for the cities or the CC polymers?
For the cities, if this is with the cities.
This is with the cities, yes.
Yeah.
And so this is with the full permitted capacity, so whatever that number is, and I'll look to Nick or someone from the city to answer. I just don't have those numbers on the top of my head. I have to look in my tables to answer that, so.
Right, so the design is for 30 million gallons a day. The actual right is a little greater, but I'll let Will answer that.
The permitted value is going to be 51.5.
I want to just make sure I understand the density difference. When you have surface, it's a density difference at the surface due to the addition of desalination.
Correct, yes.
It's not the difference, we don't see here the difference between the density at the surface and on the bottom.
Yeah, that's the next plot coming up.
Okay.
It's coming up, yep. So this is not stratification, this is just the density difference by itself. And then we're gonna look at stratification, the next one, yep. Any other questions on this, clarification questions?
Just one
before we go
more,
next one? Yeah.
pretty simple, I think. Has 0, 1, 2, -1, -2. earlier we were looking at like 35 to 40. Is that like, say, 35, 36, 37? Is that what 1, 2 means?
Yeah, so basically, if you go back to this, what you were pointing out, right, in the, so let's just zoom into that part where we were looking at before. So here, we were looking at, the blue line was at around 35, the solid line, and then the dashed line is at about maybe 36-ish, 36.5, something like that. So the difference for this, and for all of these, I think the convention is positive means desal is increasing the salinity, negative means desal is decreasing, right? So in this case, it would be positive, right? Because the dashed line is more than the solid line. It's 1.5, right? So if you look at the same period here, so what is that, around September? Thereabouts, late August, early September. In the next page, that's this one right here. So you see that those two peaks here, about 1 to 1.5, 1 to 1.5 that we saw in the previous figure. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Great. Okay, so this shows the differences themselves, like the actual differences. The next one, the more important one, I think, in terms of like, how does the stratification change? So this is more differencing. So now we have the bottom and the surface values for without desal and with desal. So we first calculate the difference of the bottom salinity and the surface salinity. That gives us an estimate of the salinity difference vertically, right? For the without desal discharge. We do the same for with desal discharge. So the top panel shows the salinity difference. The middle panel shows the density difference calculated similarly. And the bottom panel shows the difference in the stratification, meaning, so you have the bottom minus surface without desal, bottom minus surface with desal, and then it's the difference of that difference. So that's the second derivative I was talking about earlier, right? Is everybody tracking that? Okay, so let's take this one at a time here. Oh, and sorry, I should point out. So these were calculated over 24-hour averages, and that was, this goes to the duration piece of the Clean Water Act, right? So is there a sustained stratification? So you would have a lot of noise, like, where things change rapidly. And if it mixes, then it's not as much of a problem as it is if it persists for a long time. And so, and we picked 24 because for dissolved oxygen under the Clean Water Act, your typical DO standard is made on the basis of the daily minimum, right? So the duration piece is daily. That's how this 24-hour average basis is. But we could, you can look at it sub-daily, you can look at it at 48 hours, it'll just smooth things out even more. And so we picked 24 hours, but if there are any suggestions, we're happy to look at those in different ways. Generally, the longer you average, the smoother it'll get. The narrower the averaging window, the noisier it'll be, right? So it'll be difficult to tell what the actual differences are. But if you keep it at a sufficient enough duration, then you're actually going to pick out the signal from the noise, right? And I think 24-hour does a pretty good job of that. So, okay, so let's zoom in here. So let's, again, just a reminder on the color convention here. With desal is blue, without desal is blue, and then with desal is red, right? And for the top side, that's for the bottom panel. Let's make sure that we get this right. Right, we're looking at stratification. Sorry, I need to remind myself. Yes, so you'll only have 2 lines here. I'm like, I was looking for 3 lines, and then you won't have 3 lines here. So this is just the bottom minus the surface, and then some of the differences for without desal is this blue, and then with desal is this red. And you can see here over time That there are periods where it goes up, there are periods where it comes back down, there are periods where it's even lower. So it basically tells you like that stratification shifts a little bit in time, right? And then they'll be more apparent in the depth profiles.
So I guess I've always been thinking of this in two aspects. One is short time domain, like between tides periods, and then long term. So can fish die within 24 hours because at a time period at which there's little flow due to tide, and we have no other influence other than power plant flow, does that for a period of time cause enough change to kill fish in a short period? And then the longer time, which I think we're kind of looking at here. And you just mentioned that there's too much noise in this model right now to look at, and it smooths it out, but it doesn't answer the question of, in a shorter time domain, would we do something kind of spiky to the salinity? So how do you speak to the short term? Is that another model study in order to?
No, I mean, we can calculate this instantly too, right? Like you can take the raw outputs and do the same figure.
Yeah.
So the basis for 24 hours, right, the duration part of it. So I'm not a biologist, so I'm not speaking for biological effects here at all. This is just based on my knowledge of water quality standards, how it's promulgated across the country under the Clean Water Act. A lot of the times, the dissolved oxygen standards are set based on aquatic life use, which is, to protect biota at a specific water body, right? And it is usually the most sensitive biological species that they base it on and say, like, if it's a warm water habitat, they'd set the standard one way. If it's a cold water habitat, they'd set the standard different ways. So for example, on the West Coast in salmonids, where you have the cold water fish like salmonids, the DO standards are like 10 milligrams per liter, right? Because they're very sensitive to oxygen. And so there, the Clean Water Act aquatic life use is set on the basis of the daily minimum, because that's the duration component of the Clean Water Act. So essentially what they're saying is there's an acute piece and then there's a chronic piece, right? So if fish are exposed to dissolved oxygen below that on a daily basis, then it can have adverse effects on biological use. That's one of the rationales for that. Again, I'm not a biologist. I don't want to speak for what I don't even have a good understanding or handle of what the species are here. So I don't want to speak for Corpus Christi Bay in general. But the 24-hour duration has like a grounding in the Clean Water Act and how they promulgate the standards for DO. So that's where that rationale is coming from. And that often is based on, aquatic life protection, so.
I have a question for Nick. When this goes to council on June 2nd, this modeling, I suppose, it will just have what they're saying as far as, the modeling, but it won't have any input from the real world effects that the biologists, professionals here they might not even have time to run it, to say, okay, if this is what the modeling shows, then this is what we're predicting actual impacts to the bay through a biologist perspective. That won't be brought to council on June 2nd, right?
Sure, Carrie. So I'll just review the time frame. Of course, the modeling team is working through this. There's another step, and that's May 28th, a week from today. They'll provide those, and it'll be another meeting just like this. On June 2nd, we are asking the modeling team to present all of the data as per the scope that all of us has put forth. And they are the modelers that this committee and city staff jointly selected. So that's what they're gonna be presenting on. They have not been asked to develop a biological or marine aquatic life assessment, I think is what it's called. So this is what they'll be presenting as these findings. I mean, the critical component has always been the salinity in the bay, ever since day one.
Since council is lay people, like myself, If they just know, oh, it's gonna go up 2, or whatever, they're not gonna know what that's actually gonna mean to the health of the bay. And so I was wondering if there's gonna be anyone at council to interpret through a professional PhD's perspective, from the UTMSI and HRI and all these people who are here, if anyone is going to interpret it for council, what does this mean? How is the council gonna know, oh, 2 above, that's totally cool, let's go for it?
So I think that's a complex question, so I think we've got a lot more work to do. I'll speak for you, Pradeep. You've got a lot more work to do between now and then.
Yes.
And this committee will see that next week. I mean, you're right. What we're seeing right now is 1 to 1.5 parts per thousand. And we know the salinity in the bay naturally, fluctuates 15,000 parts per trillion. So we know that's going on naturally. All of that being said, I think we've got to let Pradeep and his team continue to work through this process that's been outlined. All of us has to digest this information, and then of course we'll all come back together in a week.
Okay, thank you.
I will say that Mr. Zanoni, back, I believe it was in March, is on the record in this room stating that he wanted fisheries impacts from the modeler in their final report. And he wanted that in the contract. Unfortunately, I have a copy of the contract, and that's not in the contract. So we really have no way, like to Carrie's point, council members, they have a million things on their mind. The whole purpose of this, and I think it was stated many times in the past, was what impact to the fishery is this going to cause, or if any impact or no impact. And you can go back on these YouTube videos, and I have, and you can see Mr. Zanoni saying, yeah, I want that in that contract. I want the fisheries report and this and that. But unfortunately, the contracting department never put that in there. So
Well,
I think we have a gap to fill somewhere in that point.
So I just wanted to ask Jesse, because he's a marine biologist, uses this water on this site and uses it to take care of a huge number of animals from the bay and from elsewhere. Is any of this worry you?
Not yet.
Okay, got it.
To that point, I would recommend we let Pradeep and team finish going through all the data. And to Jesse's point, I appreciate that, we need to see what's being presented. I mean, we've got a long meeting scheduled today. There's a lot of information we want to go through. We want all of you to see it. I want to see it.
Yeah, and I'll also state that, we're presenting the key objective of this modeling exercise is to see whether the brine discharge is significantly altering the stratification regime of the Corpus Christi Bay at large, right? The salinity itself doesn't give you that. It is one component of it. The part that is important is that difference, right? And that's, to that extent, this model is doing what it was designed to do, to provide the information you need to assess the risk. So just taking this in isolation would not be appropriate. So I just want to say that I'm showing all of this so that you can see that these are the differences, so everybody appreciates like what is the impact and how long those impacts persist, and what changes are there. But is this salinity lethal by itself? Probably not, right? Because that is well within the range of what's happening in the bay. So that's what I want us to make sure that we don't lose sight on, like the stratification piece versus the actual numbers themselves.
So maybe I'm slow today, but bear with me. So I have ruptured cells, algal cells in seawater with a salinity change as a potential oil separation process. So I guess when I'm looking at short term versus 24-hour average, from an osmotic pressure change standpoint, I'm looking at, could this affect fish in the short term? So you went to what the standards, the EPA, the 24-hour, that's kind of that's not picking up what I was looking for, is there during the slow interchange times, again, the predominant flow is going to be, I believe, from the power plant in terms of what happens at the ship channel and then transfer into Nueces Bay. But I just want to be assured that we're not missing something that happens on a 6-hour basis that is it gets smoothed out by just picking up 24-hour points. You're saying I'm seeing instantaneous here?
Well, this one is instantaneous. I showed you the instantaneous results right here.
Okay.
So these are the actual, like, real-time different, like, you know, instantaneous as in at the frequency at which the model outputs it.
But the time frame there is months, right, on the bottom there?
Yeah.
So if we were to zoom in, I could see.
You would see the same number, it'll just be like stretched out.
Right.
So this is the actual, like, you know, 30-minute impact, right, 30-minute difference data going into calculating.
So in no case am I missing short-term excursions?
Correct. So these are the actual magnitudes of the differences in high frequency.
Okay.
So this is what we're averaging for the purpose of, just when you do the differencing, like it just gets very noisy, right? You're trying to line up data, but once you smooth it out, then what you really do not want to miss, you do not want to miss the forest for the trees. That's a good analogy here, right? So the instantaneous values are your like trees, right? The averaging smoothing is going to show you whether there is a forest or not. So.
Well, it's the smoothing that concerns me, that we're smoothing out something. I just want to be assured that I'm not missing short-term fluctuation.
Yeah, the short-term fluctuation is reconciled in that 24-hour averaging, right? So if you have like a huge difference, that would pull the average up.
That would what?
That would pull the average up, right? The difference, so.
Let's go ahead and continue with the presentation so we can go through all of the information. And then we come back to the questions, but any clarification that needs to be done on the graphs, please let us know.
Yeah, thank you. So this is showing the stratification, and we've only looked at one location so far. So we got maybe 20 to go through, so, and 2 times that with 2 scenarios. So,
Can you show the bottom graph?
yeah. So the bottom graph is showing the salinity and the density both. So the purple shaded part is the salinity differences. We're using the same scale for these because these are differences. So keep in mind that salinity units are in ppt and the density differences are in kilograms per cubic meter. This actually shows like where you have like, you know, periods of sustained increase in salinity and density, right? And so that's important. This is where you can have a potential anoxia set up, if at all, right? And so, and then what it also shows that is really important is that it goes in both directions, right? Sometimes it's actually like, you know, your existing conditions are more stratified than the brine. And that simply has to do with how that salt wedge is moving back and forth, right? Just shifts the position of that. And then, you know, also important to point out here, right? During the tidal cycles and you know, the tidal changes, it does mix up when the tidal energy is high enough, and then that happens frequently as well. So it's not like it's persisting over years. What would be really troubling is if this was just starting to deviate, and then you just have this salt bed sitting there and not moving anywhere, but you're not seeing that. It sits there for a while, and then the tides mix it up. It sits there for a while, and the tides mix it up. And that's kind of what you're seeing throughout in the edge of the outer harbor. So now let's actually look at the other locations, similar figures. So I'll try to go through them quickly because we're already at 12:40 here. So this is in the central inner harbor. If it's okay with everybody, can we just go to the differences, because the differences are a lot more meaningful? Yeah, okay, so. So these are the actual salinity differences with and without desal, right? So let's zoom in here. Again, blue is the bottom, red is the surface, and then the green is the depth average. So here you're actually consistently seeing higher salinities for an extended period, right? Until that winter, they don't all come together again. It doesn't come to zero until that winter. So what this is telling us is that you're increasing the salinity of the inner harbor on the whole, which kind of makes sense. You're putting salt in there, so it's going to increase the salt concentration, and that's what you're seeing there, right? And you're taking fresh water out, so that has to concentrate it. So intuitively, that's the kind of result you'd expect. The question is, what's the magnitude of these differences? It's typically 1 ppt or less. There are periods where it goes up to about 2, but for the most part, it's like 1 to 1.5 in the inner harbor, and then it dies down. And what's also interesting here is that you generally see an increase in the surface salinity overall, right? And that's the tides mixing up that salt. When you have a strong tide coming in, that brine gets mixed up, and then everything, the surface salinity increases as well as a result. So that's why it's relevant in two ways. It doesn't necessarily over-stratify, it increases the salinity. So it's kind of like a little mind-bending. I had to think about it a bit. I'm like, okay, this is what's happening. So there is a mixing process happening, but there's also a stratification process, and we'll see what the stratification effect is in the next one. So the bottom one shows the density differences. And again, when you have more salt, the water is going to be denser overall, and that's what you're seeing here. What is interesting here is there are periods where the bottom is denser than the top, but again, which more or less coincides with the periods where you have higher salinity differences as well, and then they tend to come together. Very similar pattern, right? In the winter, you see that difference disappearing. Okay, so in the third one, this is the stratification, bottom minus surface, and then the differences with and without desal. So let's actually go straight to the bottom panel here, because it kind of shows the overall effects on the inner harbor. Similar to what you had in the outer harbor, a little bit higher than what you have at mouth. So going in, you're seeing more of that effect in terms of the brine discharge, as opposed to at the mouth. Okay. So let's look at, So this is all the way at the Viola turning basin, and you're, let's actually go right to the differences. Again, similar to what we saw there, except here the duration parts are a little bit lower than where the bottom is separating out. Overall, you're seeing higher salinities, and this just has to do with the farther you go out, the more it mixes, right? And so that's what you're seeing in the water column there. By the time you get farther in, it's more or less mixed, but that salinity concentration overall is higher. That's why you see the difference is consistently positive for the most part. Same with density, right? Overall, it's somewhat denser. So this is the bottom minus the surface. This is the stratification. Again, this shows there are periods where it's more stratified than without the discharge, and then there are periods where it also sort of balances out and mixes up. Okay, so now let's get to the more fun part. Oops. Okay, so this is just the inner harbor. So I think we can, I'll minimize this, we can come back to this if we need to. So next we'll look at the Corpus Christi ship channel. I'm only showing the stratification plots here, but we have similar figures for all of them. In the interest of time, I'm going to just stick to this one as our primary way to show it, but there are places where we'll go back to the other ones, like Nueces Bay. We'll look at all of it. So this is Corpus Christi Ship Channel 1. So if you look, if you can picture the overall map that I showed earlier, this is a little farther out in the ship channel in Corpus Christi Bay. Not all the way out, but maybe I want to say a mile and a half out from the mouth of the harbor, maybe a couple of miles out. So the key thing to point out, very similar patterns in terms of the, the salinity differences. Interesting thing here is that the salinity, the differences in the surface, in the stratification for the current conditions are actually more showing the channel is more stratified than without the discharge, right? And it probably just shifts that salt wedge. It's farther, it's persisting farther out into the channel now, it's getting pushed further in with the brine discharge. And also, the second part of it too is like, under current conditions, you don't have overall, there's less salt in the system too. So that's important to keep in mind. So the density one, the bottom stratification one, surface minus bottom, is more interesting here. So again, like the channel is somewhat more stratified under with the brine discharge than it is without, right? So you see a lot of positive differences here. However, you also see a lot of negative values. There are periods where the channel is actually less stratified compared to current conditions. So there are periods where the channel is more stratified under current conditions, and there are periods where it is less, and that timing shifts a little bit back and forth between the two. And of course, in winter, it does mix completely because the tidal energy is very strong, and there is good amount of mixing happening.
When you said 1 mile or 2 miles, do you have a map showing
Yeah,
where
we
this
do.
is measured? And did you measure at the mouth of the harbor as well?
Yeah, that's what we were looking at before at the mouth of the harbor. Now, so sorry, let me go back to this. Yeah, we probably need to have a cheat sheet for this map so we can keep coming back to this. Yeah, this guy. So first we looked at the turning basin, Inner Harbor Central, and right at the mouth. Ship Channel 1 is a little further out, right? So I just took a guess that it's 1 or 2 miles, but I didn't actually measure it. So, yeah.
I just wanted to, the point of the buffering, I guess when I did some models myself, I caught myself misunderstanding. I was always thinking of we're going to be moving the salt out towards the Gulf. But then when I looked at the Gulf salinities, they were higher. So we got a buffer that's up here. And I think what we're really doing is raising the salinity of our precious inland freshwater where we have the fish hatching. So it's not moving the salt out as much as getting enough freshwater inflow to maintain that lower salinity along the base. So as we're doing this, I just want to go back to your input conditions that you went to. Everything out there was higher salinity at the Gulf interchange point, the boundary condition. You mentioned this new one, was it HICOM?
It was around 34 at the boundary.
It was around 34.
Yeah.
So we get above that, I guess, in a little of these cases.
Well, we get more than that actually. In the Ship Channel, even under current conditions, it's higher, and in USS Bay, it's higher to it. There are periods where different subembayments actually are higher than the Gulf of Mexico salinity.
Yes. So the bait shops and that tell us how when we get these freshwater inflows and the salinity goes lower, we get a lot of shrimp. So we're really needing to think about is how much of that are we preserving here against this buffer that's typically higher. And we go above that at times here, that's true, but our best conditions are when we stay lower. So I think as you're looking at it, you got to the time duration. Does this additional salt input cause for those durations of higher salinity in the areas we'd like to maintain lower? Does that persist longer? So again, it's back to your question.
So I'm going to clarify something here. We're not actually putting more salt in. We're putting the salt that we're taking back. What we're taking out is fresh water. So
right, it's anti-dilution.
Yeah, we're concentrating it.
Right.
Yeah. So from a mass perspective, the mass of salt remains the same, right? Like, more or less the same. Like maybe there's some evaporative differences, but.
Well, except as to where it ends up, Nueces Bay.
Right, so you're shifting the salt balance, yeah, absolutely, so.
You're also adding in a little bit from the process that the plant itself puts into the water, right? Like defouling agents or something, or some other kind of chemicals that would be discharged that's allowed through the EPA, but it's not just exactly how it comes out of the bay. They take out the fresh water and they put it exactly in. There's more that the plant adds in, right?
The plant isn't adding in additional salt or salinity.
Not salt. They're adding in processed chemicals that the plant has to use that would then be discharged with the waste.
Those are many, many orders of magnitude less. It's beyond the accuracy of the model. Very small quantities.
But still, it's something that wasn't in the bay before the desalination happened. It's something else that's added, just statement of fact.
But you wouldn't be able to detect that.
Mrs. Tobin, don't we extract a lot? There were 4 or 5 truckloads heading to the landfills in the coagulation process. So really, we're taking out rather than putting in some of these other suspended solids, basically, right?
That's correct. So there will be solid removed from the process and deposited at our landfills.
Can we move on?
Yeah.
It's not related to the model.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this is, did we already see ship channel 2 or no? No, this is the first time we're seeing this. Okay. So, yeah, we finished ship channel 1, right? So this is ship channel 2 that I've moved down to. So everybody good with that? So, so the key thing that I want to point out here are that the stratification patterns overall are actually not that dissimilar between current conditions and with desal, right? So by the time you get here, there are differences still. There are some periods where you see the blue and red start to deviate from each other. And again, remember that red is with desal and blue is without desal. In the top is the stratification as estimated through salinity difference, and then this is the density difference. But the patterns start to mimic each other a lot closer as you go farther into the channel, right? So the difference is like that you had more of those separations and shifts once you were in the inner harbor, but those shifts are not as apparent here. And that is also clear in the overall sort of like the difference between the two, right? There are still periods where it's different. It's not as extensive. It is more short-lived here, those differences. And it's also not as big as it was. Like you had 1 to 1.5 ppt difference, but now it's, you rarely get to 1, right? Most of the time it's a lot smaller. So that's really the key point here is like as you go farther out, those differences are starting to diminish. So, okay, so depth profiles. Now let me walk through what these are first before we, this is an animation, so it's going to challenge you all to watch wiggly worms, and you'll have to track 2 worms together, so at 5 different locations. So the blue line here is I got the wrong animation here. This was supposed to come later. It does say hypothetical worst case, isn't it? So I think I put the wrong animation in here. We can come back to this because I was going to present this later, but it's just duplicated here. And I cannot hook up my computer here, and pull the right one. Oh, that's a shame because it's actually quite fun to watch this. Let's see if I got the spring one right. My apologies. Oh, they both say hypothetical worst case. Sorry, my apologies. I just put the wrong animation in here. We can come back to this. This essentially, so this is still very meaningful. What this will show us is how that salt wedge moves between that spring, the spring neap cycle that we saw, and in both when there is freshwater inflow and when there is not freshwater inflow. But the interesting part is here you can actually see how that salinity pattern shifts between the 5 different channel locations that we've seen so far, starting from Yellow Basin, coming out to Ship Channel 2, and you'll see these move around. you don't have context for the hypothetical worst case simulations yet, so we'll come back to this. We'll look at it at the end of the presentation. But I also would, next week, I'll be sure to put the right depth profiles for you all and show you the ones that for the current conditions as well. They're actually not, spoiler alert, they're not that different. They look very similar overall. So looking at this is more or less like looking at the other one. So okay, so I'm going to skip those. And again, I apologize for that. That was very fun to watch. So this one, now we're coming out into the shallower parts in Corpus Christi Bay, right? So this is so now we're looking, it was one thing that was kind of expected is that your salt is dense, it's going to stay in the bottom and it's going to stay there. Now the question is that going to mix, come up, and increase the salinity in the shallower parts of the bay overall? And is that going to cause differences in stratification, right? So this is, from a surface area perspective, this can have broader impacts than a very narrow channel in terms of differences. So that's sort of the importance here. So really what we're looking for when we start looking at these figures is do we see the duration of persisting extended stratification in the shallows because of the model, the brine discharge, meaning it's increasing the salinity, but is it increasing disproportionately, or is it concentrating it in some parts of the bay more than others? Oh, sorry, did you want to? Okay, so we'll start with, actually, why does, I was going to go click on that, there, open file here. So I think it's worth just looking at the salinities and the temperatures here at these locations in just, go away, right. Again, so now we're actually looking at the actual predictions. The solid lines are without desalination, the dashed lines are with desalination. Red is surface, blue is bottom, green is depth average, right? Top panel here at North Beach, you're looking at salinity predictions, both with and without desal. So the important point here is that, it's, first of all, there is not much of it in terms of stratification, right? They're all on top of each other, and you would expect that it's shallow. What we're looking to see is, are you starting to see a separation in them? And you're not seeing that either, right? Meaning there are some periods where you see a slight separation, some level of stratification, but that's very short-lived. It's not nowhere near as what you're seeing in the channel. And more importantly, there's barely any separation between the predicted salinities between the two scenarios, with and without discharge. So all in all, what this is telling us is that, your conditions don't really change appreciably when you come to the shallow, at least in North Beach. Now we'll look at all of the locations. Right, I mean, that's right, and it's important, right? So you have a lot of habitat habitat is a surface area concept, right? So most of the surface area is shallow. And so for an extended area, you're not impacting it. The impact is more in the differences are more in the channel, right? Which is a relatively deeper portion. So,
sorry.
Yeah.
I was just, can you remind me what the vertical resolution is, for instance, at the North Beach site?
Everywhere there should be at least 2 layers. There can be 3 or 4 depending on the depth. So yeah. So the model will have at least 2. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Pradeep, just as a note, we have 1 hour left.
Yeah.
So we can have time to review the hypotheticals and leave time for the discussion and the questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the reminder. Yep. Okay. So let's actually go right to the differences here. So this shows the difference in salinities between the existing and with and without, right? So this is, again, surface, bottom, and depth average. The differences are very similar to begin with, right? So you do see some positive differences consistently, so that just shows this overall more salt, right? But from a stratification perspective, which is of bigger interest, we'll see that in the next slide here. even the 24-hour average is actually quite noisy here. But really the bottom one is going to tell us the story. So these are, even on a 24-hour average basis, it's literally, for all practical purposes, this is zero, bouncing around zero, right? So you don't really see any difference in stratification in the shallows. You wouldn't expect that, it just confirms that, and which is good. So next site is the bayfront. This is to the south of the channel. Again, very similar, not a lot of difference in between the lines. There is some spiky behavior here, right? And that's the difference. These are the instantaneous differences. And then when you look at the depth, the changes in stratification, you see that it's both positive and negative. It just bounces around that zero for the most part. And there are periods where you see a bigger difference. That actually, the negative difference says that it's, the current conditions actually stratify more. But to me, it's, they're practically the same. Just the magnitude of that is important here too, right? In the previous ones, we saw a bigger magnitude. Here, they're all very small overall for both salinity and density. So, okay. So I'm going to quickly go through the other locations here. It's not working. Oh, that's because that's all I have there. We have to go back to the slide here. Okay, let's put that back up here. So this is in Portland on the other side to the north, farther out. So it's not as close to the inner harbor. And so as you would expect, these differences are even smaller here, but the pattern itself is you don't really get a whole lot out of it other than, there are some subtle shifts, nothing really in one direction or the other. They're all, for the most part, it's very similar. So this is at the Tamu location. This is that was to the north, this is to the south of the channel, farther out. And again, this is significantly farther out, and then the next two locations that we'll see are even further out, closer to the Gulf. Same. Now you're starting to see more zeros, which is good, which means that it's even smaller, right? It's basically numerical noise at this point, not a whole lot of differences consistently. Shamrock, close to the Gulf there, and I think this is on the south side. Yeah, this is on the south side. Small differences like before, and South CC Bay. Oh, so that was to the north, so this is to the south. So got my locations mixed up. So again, it's a pretty consistent story. Really, the only place where you're seeing the duration of higher salinities and stratification is in the channel, and within the inner harbor in particular, and then it starts to diminish as you come farther out so far. Okay, so that's Corpus Christi Bay proper. Now let's look at Nueces Bay. So the interesting thing to keep in mind for Nueces Bay is that anything that happens in the inner harbor gets withdrawn by the power plant and released in there. So you're going to see the effect of some of that here in terms of the salinities and the density differences. So we'll start looking from Nueces Bay 1, which is right under the bridge here. Nueces Bay 2 is the closest to the discharge for the power plant. And then these two would have more freshwater influences, 3 and 4, right? So, Redfish Bay snuck in here. That's because I clicked too fast. I had to open this one. So, okay. All right, so again, it's worth just looking at one of these at least for Nueces Bay. And we can look at Nueces 2 if you want, because that's the closest. Let's start with that one. So you have the surface is red, blue is the bottom, gray is the depth average, solid is without decel, dashed out with decel, right? So top panel is salinity. Both show some mild stratification in Nueces Bay, right? But meaning like you see the difference between the bottom and the surface salinities. There are some gaps here that you're seeing in some areas, like where it does start to deviate a little bit. But again, I want to point to the differences here. Like it's really just less than half, and you're going to see that more clearly in the next slide. So this is where you probably, if you're picking up the signal, this is where you'll pick it up right away. And maybe there are some times of the year where you do pick up that signal from the brine discharge, but it's not a persistent one in general. Really like the density differences are even smaller. That kind of tells you like, that small salinity increase is really not big enough to make a big impact on the density. So if you look at actual differences though, like it's very similar to what you're seeing in the Corpus Christi Bay proper, right? It's both up and down, meaning like sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. Overall, you're not seeing a persistent, like you saw in the Inner Harbor, a persistent positive trend of density differences or salinity differences. Like those small periods that I pointed out earlier, that's where you actually see that, come about. It's more than a day for sure, right? So that's why you're seeing that for a few days. And so you're seeing overall, like, if you look at this is actually very, very illustrative too. The stratification patterns are almost identical, right? Like you're really not, like it's not substantively different between the two. So we can do the same for the other Nueces Bay locations.
Just 1 second.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that we're all interpreting this correctly. So the top graph here is showing us that the maximum, salinity difference between the bottom and the surface waters in the top panel are on the range of 1 part per thousand. One and a little bit more. So it's not a very high difference in salinity between the surface and the bottom.
Yep, Nueces Bay, because it's shallow, it's not stratifying, right? That's basically what it's saying. To begin with, it doesn't stratify. So the question is, by adding the brine, are we actually creating more of a stratified conditions?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
thanks for that.
We're not seeing that when we look at the density difference. We do see that there is a density difference between the bottom and the surface of up to 1 kilogram per meter cubed.
Correct.
On the
density
second panel.
the second panel, right. So this is, again, so this shows that there are density differences within Nueces Bay, right?
Without desalination.
Even without desalination.
Exactly.
Correct, exactly. Thanks for that clarification,
Yes,
absolutely.
and that's an important point. So this
Yeah.
is showing without desalination, we do see that there is stratification, density difference between the bottom and the surface in Nueces Bay. When you add the desalination, we're not seeing a huge difference relative to what is already there.
Correct, yeah.
That is what this is telling us.
Yep, exactly, yeah. And that's sort of our goal of this work is to identify whether addition of the brine shifts the stratification regime, right? And so, and we need to keep coming back to that as a reminder. Is like, is it shifting it or not, right? That's what we're assessing, as opposed to whether it's actually stratified, which is important from a model validation perspective, but not, and an interpretation perspective, but the goal here is not to say whether or not it's stratified. It's to recognize that it does stratify, but it doesn't shift the stratification regime. So,
super deep. I'm wondering if you could maybe help me work this out in my mind a little bit. So In a shallow location like this site, I'm guessing it's probably what, 2 meters deep at most?
Yeah, maybe 2 to 3 meters, something like
Okay.
that, yeah.
So if you have a vertical resolution, let's say you have two layers, right? So that means the bottom layer would, that would take an average of conditions in, let's say, a meter of water, right? So in terms of stratification and hypoxia, what we know, at least from Corpus Christi Bay, even from the shallow areas, is that stratification layer, the natural layer that occurs, it's on the order of like 0.1 to 0.2 meters. So it sounds to me like at this resolution, you might not be resolving any obvious changes that are happening in stratification just because the vertical resolution of the model is not sufficient, right?
Yeah, but that's not the scale at which the question is posed to the model, right? So the goal here is to see whether you have a persistent pattern. And what this is telling us is that you don't.
Let me think on that one a little while.
Yeah. I mean, like, your point of like, can we resolve it finally and will you see a difference? You can, like, you can always, at infinity, it's you're resolving nature perfectly, right? And so the more finer you go, the more precise you're gonna get. Doesn't mean it's more accurate.
Yeah.
So-
I think also the magnitude of the difference in the density, so again, the second panel is important. So just to give people a rule of thumb, 0.1 is slightly stratified, so that's not, that probably would break up with a wind event
Yeah,
or whatever. And a value of 1 difference in the density between the bottom and the high would be considered stratified, like highly stratified, where you would have more of a lid on the surface layer to allow oxygen to go down to the bottom layer. So
Yeah.
we're looking at high values that are prolonged over time and that therefore could be conducive to hypoxia.
Yeah, thank you. So then that's the key, right? So the picnic line, is there a real picnic line or not? And there is not a real picnic line here. That's the point, right? And so, I mean, you'll always see some level of stratification happening and then the energy in the system through wind, through tides, through freshwater inflows, even through your discharge probably, right? Like all of them is going to mix it up very quickly. So it's not a
But
persistent.
there are events like the last several days where we see, values of 0.25 to 0.5, which means that there is some stratification in the system.
Yeah.
What happens with the oxygen right now, we're not saying. It's just there is some occasions and conditions under which it does happen.
Yeah, I mean,
This
there's
has been documented for the bay. So
right, and also, there is freshwater inflow into the system, right? So naturally, the freshwater is going to come in on top and stay there, and the salt water is going to stay in the bottom, right? So there'll be some of that happening, and the model does capture that, so.
Pradeep, is this with or without desal in operation?
It's got both.
It's got both.
Yeah, they're on top of each other. You're not able to tell them apart,
Okay.
so.
Oh, okay.
So, that's the point.
So because of the depth of Nueces Bay, and this is it consistent throughout Nueces Bay, all about that 1 to 2 meters, or?
It differ, I think the bathymetry changes a little bit.
I boat in Nueces Bay, kayak and motorboat. You have to really watch where you're going and know where you're going, or you'll hit a sandbar, or you'll hit a shallow part or oyster reef. And there are some channels for boats that they've marked out. But I would say maybe an average depth might be, 5 feet.
Okay, yeah, that helps, Gary. I was just curious. So what we're seeing is without those external conditions, it's stratified under normal circumstances. Right?
Correct, yeah.
Except for wind, tides, freshwater events. I think that's what the doctor said.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically this is saying, because the prediction, the correction to the salinity regime in Nueces Bay was much more reasonable, much more realistic. What this is saying is under natural conditions, you do have some events of stratification. And when you're adding the desalination, the model is saying that it doesn't look like a huge difference. It's not like there's no stratification without the desalination, then all of a sudden you have a lot of stratification with the desalination. That's not what the results are saying. but there is stratification in the system, right? So that can lead to certain effects, but.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, like, does the desalination discharge exacerbate that stratification? It appears it does not, so. Okay, so same in, so Nueces Bay 3, further out, more freshwater influence, but the story is pretty similar, right? So the differences are pretty much, bouncing around that 0. And again, the magnitude is important here, very, very small differences. So this is actually, to the point earlier, right? When you get a freshwater inflow event, this is when you saw that hydrograph that I showed earlier, you could have stratified conditions, and that's probably what that is, right? So this density difference here is because of that freshwater inflow. So when there is freshwater inflow, it's obviously going to flow on the top. It's not going to, then the salt will boom in the bottom, right? So that's what you're seeing here. Okay, so Nueces Bay 4, so 115, okay, let's just keep going here. Nueces Bay 4, even further closer to the boundary, and then very similar to what you saw in Nueces Bay 3. So these gets a little bit more spiky here than other locations. Recognize that this is getting closer to the boundary of the model too, so you're going to have some boundary effects as well. So. Yep. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint. Oops, sorry, wrong one. So this is at Redfish Bay. Again, similar to Nueces Bay here, the model is saying that there is some stratification in Redfish Bay. This is also influenced by freshwater inflows from the north. The difference is with or without desal is really not like substantial, right? It's more or less, around the 0 part. So, okay, now we're going to start looking at results for the hypothetical worst case. So we're done looking at, well, we can go back to any of them, but I want to get through this one too, so you'll have perspective on how things shift with the hypothetical worst case. So here, all of the conditions that we talked about earlier apply, right? So we have sea level rise condition, temperature increase, ocean temperature increase, additional brine discharge into the inner harbor, no fresh water inflow. And yeah, those are all the main ones, right? And then also, and Allison discharges have been removed in this. So those are all simulated in this one. So the base case is all of them without desalination, and then the scenario is all of them with the desalination discharge, right? So that's what we're comparing here. So the first thing I want to just, highlight before we get in to provide some context. This is not a comparison between with and without desal. This is more a comparison between what does the hypothetical scenario look like relative to existing conditions when you have sea level rise, when you have additional salinity. So just to give you context. So these are the observations compared to, and again, we don't expect run 23 to match this. Run 23 is the hypothetical worst case existing condition without desal. The reason we're showing this is to see that you've shifted the water levels up because you're simulating sea level rise, right? So in general, what you're seeing is that run 23 water levels have shifted up. So these are at, which location is this? USS Lexington. This is just outside the inner harbor. So this is more a check to make sure that, we are raising when we raise the sea level, like the water levels in the bay go up too. So this is more a check. And the second panel here shows the effect of, without desal, what is that effect of increasing that sea level on the salinities? And it's very small, but you do see a very marginal increase, but persistent marginal increase relative to without that sea level rise condition, right? And I think that's also true for temperature. For temperature, you see, again, the tidal noise makes it hard to pick that out, but generally, if you really zoom in, you can probably pick it up a little bit. The slight increase overall. It's usually, it's more obvious near the ocean than it is here, farther in. Okay, so that was just to provide context that, that's what how the base case shifts everything. So there's a little bit increase overall baseline higher salinity under the hypothetical worst case. And that's what, so that everything shifts up or down by that.
Before we move, are the contexts like clear so we can move on, try to keep it at 20 minutes with no interruptions, and then come back for the questions? Are we okay?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, so channel location. So we'll start with the channel. Similar patterns like what you saw before. Again, the dashed line here, these are actual salinity predictions between the model with and without desal. There are periods where you see a persistent difference, surface that is not really a big difference, and on a depth average basis, maybe less, a little bit somewhere in between the two. You see some of that spring neap signals that we talked about under the current conditions. So you see those patterns here too. And overall, everything went up, but it didn't really, the differences are still relatively the same in terms of, with and without desal. Okay, so there's temperature, very similar, right? Bouncing around for both of them, it's pretty close to each other. And then for density, you're starting to see oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so the density again, they tend to, there is a little bit of separation depending on the time of the year. And then they tend to come close together, and then again, they tend to stratify again. So you see the same patterns like we saw before. Okay, so the more fun plot, which is the stratification, are you seeing persistent effect, comparable in magnitude to what we were seeing before with the desal? I wish I could remember that number off the top of my head, but it's generally in the same ballpark of 1 to 2. And I want to say, as we go further out, you'll start to see more of these, break down. Like here, it persists. Once you go into the harbor, it persists longer. You go outside, it'll tend to break down more. And that's the general pattern that we saw under current conditions, right? So let's see if we see those same things here. So they're going now into the harbor, right? So there's the inner harbor. So let's just start with this. So you're starting to see a little bit about the same ballpark magnitude, maybe relatively similar to the other one. Again, in the winter, you're seeing that breakup happening here as well in terms of the difference. So then let's go to the Wheeler Turning Basin. So here, so we saw the surface, overall the salinity levels were going up, right, within the inner harbor. And that's kind of what you're seeing here. It's not as much it's not as much a stratification per se. I mean, you do see stratification as well, but you're also seeing higher surface, bottom minus surface values. Okay, so, all right. So now let's look at the ship channel. I'm just going to go straight to the differences. So again, same pattern, you're seeing these duration events, but they do break up in ship channel 1, right? That's kind of what we saw earlier too. And then, there are periods where they completely break up. But the magnitude is about the same, right? It's about the order of 1 to 1.5 for salinity, maybe of the order of, 0 to 0.5 for density. So, ship channel 2, similar pattern. Now you're seeing those durations condense for both salinity and density. The magnitudes are starting to shrink, right? So, I want to say this, I'm not 100% sure, we have to put them side by side to compare this. But because the overall water levels are higher, I think there was a little bit of a shift inward, further inward. But I have to look at it more closely to definitively say that. But that's just me still trying to grapple with these hundreds of figures that we produced. So, yeah, okay. So I think that's on the ship channel. Now, if you look at the shallow parts, let's go back to our slide here. Further out, spatial locations out Redfish Bay. Oh, I thought I put it in here. Yeah, I'm trying to see if I actually put that figure here. It might be in that folder. I guess I didn't drop it in here. I want to make sure that I don't know. This is probably the current. This is the current condition link, I think. Sorry. I usually put a. Oh yeah, this is the current condition. So let me pull up the one with, if I assuming, hopefully I have it here. Okay, so this is the correct one. So now we're looking at North Beach in Corpus Christi Bay, very similar, bouncing around that zero line in the shallow areas, not primarily, I mean, to Dr. Hershka's point earlier, like it does stratify. There are periods where it stratifies, but very mildly. It's not very substantial. And then the bayfront, again, bouncing around zero, like what we saw before, not an appreciable shift in the patterns overall, or at least not a persistent pattern that we can pick out.
One quick question. So those peaks that you see on the middle panel, when you are not smoothing it with a 24-hour average, that's probably just the nighttime, daytime difference in the surface temperatures? Because the density is actually fluctuating.
Oh, it could be, yeah, you're right.
Right?
It could very well be, right? So there is a diurnal fluctuation in temperature. There's also a tidal component to it too, right? When you have a slack tide combined with warm temperatures, it can really have a situation where you have a stratification set up. Yeah, totally possible. Okay. Yeah, at Tamu, again, I just want to, this is more confirming that there is not a different trend that you're seeing with climate change, right? So this is at Portland. Again, all these magnitudes are relatively small in both directions. Same here, and same for Shamrock. So, okay, so, and then let's go back to this one. Let's see what else we have here. The Nueces base, this is worth definitely taking a look. Oh, I did have a link here. I just didn't open it. Okay, so this is for Nueces Bay. Again, for context, right, so this actually shows the actual salinities and temperatures and density. Like before, really not an appreciable difference, primarily because it's very shallow. And overall, you're not seeing a persistent signal between the two. In the differences are about what we saw before, right? Between very, very small, less than 1/20th.
A quick point. So when you combine the flow, the 335 MGD coming out of the power plant, you know, if we were taking all of the effluent from Inner Harbor, mixing that with 300, essentially to come up to 335, going into New Ices Bay, what is the salinity bulk increase roughly from what you see in this model? From intake to outtake of the power plant?
Oh, it's not, I mean, there is very minor consumptive component to it. We don't, like, you know, we have inflows and outflows information. It's not really, like, most of it, the flows for the intake and the discharge are the same. So there is not really a consumptive component from which would concentrate the salinity. So it's more or less whatever is coming in is going out as
I think what he's asking is if effluent from the Inner Harbor makes it to the Nueces Bay Power Station intake, how much is that increasing the salinity at the discharge into the Nueces Bay?
Yeah.
Like, you're asking the end of the pipe, right, for the power plant, not in US Bay proper.
Let's look at, so we're mixing, if we took all of the power plant effluent and said we're mixing that, call it for right now 35 MGD, to make up 335, we need 300 coming in from probably Corpus Christi Bay sort of into Inner Harbor, and then those two go together. You know, I could do it myself, but I mean,
like, did I look at the mass budgets for, like, I want to say it's like a 1 to 2 PPT increase, but I've not actually, I have to zero it out to really figure out exactly what the difference is. I could also look at the mass budgets, which I've not done yet. So.
One of the things that, you know, you typically do when you're doing computational modeling and the 3 legs of research, you do these closed form solutions to say, does this make sense?
Yeah, like,
that's what I'm kind of saying, is check that and make sure, does that make sense?
Yeah, the salt load, yeah, does it, I mean, that's a good mass conservation question, right? That's what you're asking. It's like, you know, from a mass balance perspective, does it make sense, the increase in salinity, what you're saying? I think it does, but I have not looked at, I've not done a back of the envelope calculation myself to cross-check that. So, yeah. Yeah, I can definitely do that, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the tricky part about that is going to be like the volume, the tidal, the residence time, right? The effective residence time with the New Nueces Bay. That's always a challenge in a student system to get the residence time right.
No, because you're just looking at the pipe exit.
But the pipe exit, I know what's happening here. That, like, pipe exit doesn't change. That's what I was saying earlier. Because it is not like the inflow is almost equal to the outflow. So the changes is very marginal. But how does that change the Nueces Bay salinity?
No. What I'm getting at is I just want to verify that we have, that we're showing that the salinity increase adding Inner Harbor Basin versus not, that it makes sense, that we're getting at whatever.
I see. So yeah, that's an even easier calculation. Yes, certainly we can do that. I'll be sure to present that next week. Thank you. Yeah.
Pretty, like, this is, my question is, say that none of the bays are really affected and the only really rise you see is kind of minimal in the Inner Harbor. That's kind of what I'm gathering.
Correct.
In salinity.
Yeah.
Overall. So that's for like a short amount of time. But what happens if the Inner Harbor over a period of years, as the salinity increases, if it continues to increase, I guess the modeling doesn't really show how that affects the bays then after a period of years, maybe 5 years or so. If it continues to build in the Inner Harbor, then would that eventually spill out into?
Yeah, no, it does show that actually. That's why we are looking at it over a 2-year period, right? And so in a lot of these simulations, and that's the first thing we were looking for, is it just there and doesn't go anywhere? And which means that then you'll see the conditions in Corpus Christi Bay in general start to deviate substantially. And even within the Inner Harbor, you'll see that it, you know, like it's just those 2 lines would separate out. But what you saw instead was like there were durations where they separate out, but they come back together. Meaning the tides are still strong enough to mix it out even within a reasonable sort of seasonal or even like spring neap cycles, right? And then over winter where you saw they all basically came back to 0, meaning like there is nothing really persisting from year to year. So there is no what we call, like, you know, in modeling parlance, a memory in the system, so to speak, that would persist and build up over a period of time. So that is actually a very good question and important. That's the first thing I was looking for is like, are they starting to diverge like this, or are they bouncing up and down? Then if they're bouncing up and down, how long is that event going to last in a particular location, right? So that's the next sort of your risk assessment that you do. Based on these results, what you're seeing is that, it's not like we have a blob of salt sitting and not going anywhere. It's eventually mixing out, so. Okay, so we've looked at NUSS. I think that's all the results, right? So let's see, NUSS 3 and 4, very similar. Let's see what else do we have. Oh, let's look at our fun wiggly worms here. Okay, so this, now that you've seen this, so you can actually appreciate how it's going to look for the current conditions as well. They're actually very similar, the depth profiles. What you're seeing here, this is without desal as the blue. So these are the depth profiles at each of the deep location, right? Starting from Inner Harbor Central, Outer Harbor, Ship Channel 1, and Ship Channel 2. And somehow Wheeler got dropped off, but that's fine. And then this starts so this is the spring neap cycle. So if you recall that tidal figure I showed earlier, there were 2 windows we identified, one in spring with freshwater inflow and one in summer when there's no freshwater inflow. So what we're looking for in these figures is, what does that brine discharge do to the bottom salinities, surface salinities? How does that change that depth profile of salinity? So the top panel is showing the salinity, the bottom panel is showing density, okay?
Is this showing the full depth? Because it says 8 meters on the graph.
It is showing the full depth at that location, yes, or at least the closest segment that we picked.
Okay.
So, yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's exactly at the Talweg, but there is some averaging in that, but it should be, yes. I don't think it's getting cut off, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, because I think it's 17 meters in the channel, which is about, twice as much as.
Oh, you know what? Maybe we fixed the scale. Maybe you're right. I'll check that.
These are all in the channel, aren't they? So they should all be the same depth.
Yeah, so I think Jason's point is that it can go up to 17 meters, and I'll check to make sure that that's not picking the layer next instead of the bottommost layer. But the pattern should be very similar. And I also don't know if it's 17 meters everywhere, is it? It is. It is everywhere? Okay. So, okay. So maybe it's just we're off by one segment, or that might not show the exact Talweg. So two things to fix is, one is don't put the right animation, and then 2 is make sure that it's exactly at the Talweg.
And the exact location, because I put a note in there when I sent the coordinates, because I don't have a bathymetry that you have, to make sure that those locations are actually in the channel.
Yeah, I mean, I automated that calculation to find the depth, like either pick the next segment, or that calculation is this, didn't pick the Talweg. One or the other happened here. But I mean, this gives you a good flavor for what is actually happening. You saw the bottom salinities in the other one, right? So you can already see the differences in some of these locations of very similar magnitude, of about half to 1. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just to make sure I'm following you, I mean, if this is just the top of the profile, to Jason's point, right? If this is only the top 8 meters, then.
It appears to be, yes. I mean, either I actually didn't look at the depth scale.
But when you extrapolate those lines, that it suggests in several cases that the delta between the two would be larger at the bottom of the profile, and considerably so right? I mean, if you scroll over again, yeah, those lines are beginning to diverge at the 8 meter mark. The channel is 54 feet or deeper in the main channel.
Yeah, so the
implication is that if those trends continue to diverge, you could have considerably more divergence at the bottom
yeah,
of the channel.
I mean, we will double check that. I think the bottom, we also saw the figures of the bottom salinities before too, right? In the other time series plots. So it may diverge to some extent. I don't know if that'll, it may also settle down, right? Below the picnic line, you wouldn't have a gradient that goes all the way down to your bottom. So I think it's the latter generally. Like this is a good example of that. See, this is the picnic line right there, and then it's starting to stabilize right here, right? So that's typically the way it would happen.
You think it's most likely what we're looking at is you're not at a node, a line at.
Yeah, like I'm thinking like you have to grab the exact center point to get the deepest spot. It probably grabbed the one next to it, or it's just off center is my guess. Or there could be a plotting error. Again, it's a lot of, this is where, that's why we put preliminary, we need to check it, there's a lot of, QC that still needs to happen.
So how deep is this again? How deep is this?
So this is about 25 feet, it goes down to about 25 feet right
And the
now.
ship channel is, in the inner harbor is 55, right, more or less. And that's because the ships draw so much water and they are already, can't even go two against each other like this. They have to go single file, and there's turning basins where they can turn around. It's really narrow and deep, it's like a box. And so that bottom part is where the salt's gonna build up. So to not have the bottom of the ship channel on your graph, to me, seems like a red flag.
Well, we're going to look into it. It's, so we did show the bottom salinities earlier. So it's not like we didn't look at the bottom salinities. This is probably a plotting error, or we just picked the wrong cell for each of them, right? So it just didn't pick the deepest cell. So we have results for those, obviously, so we can present them at the next meeting. So, well, maybe it's not even worth looking at it then. So let's just wait until next week, and now that we are, 145 anyway, so might as well just stick to next steps, because I don't know how much good it does if it doesn't go all the way to the bottom. Okay, so last thing I want to just touch on is we started looking at ship traffic. Thanks, Jeff, to your team for all the data. What we tried to do here is try to parse out what are some representative vessels that we can put, and what are some representative routes that we can simulate. And so based on the traffic data that we got, so majority of them are barges, but you also have a decent number of ships, right? Like 1728 over a period of like a year and 4 months or so. So that's roughly more than two to three ships transiting the harbor, right? In more than that, like per day. So something to think about is we have this information. So what the next thing that we did was what were the most common routes of transit in it for ships specifically, not barges. It turns out that it's it's this route from right at the mouth of the channel to coming out to Black Eye 1, and these names really, you're all probably a lot more familiar with this than I am. I don't have a specific reference to what kind of dock there is or what activities happen there, but that was, just statistically, that was the most frequently used route. Hopefully that chimes with your knowledge of the system. And then in terms of ship sizes, right, so these, this is just a box plot showing the distribution of the ship's size in terms of tonnage, gross tonnage, beam length, draft, and so on. Again, we tried, our goal is to kind of pick a median type ship, and then simulate it from, let's go back to the previous slide here, on this path, back and forth, right? And then we have to make some assumptions on whether it's coming in empty and getting loaded, or whether it's coming in full and going back empty. We could probably try it both ways. We originally were going to do it for 2 years. Given that we have a week, I think we could still try to get a 2-year simulation in, but the most meaningful sort of analysis of this is how much mixing do you get for periods where it does stratify, where you see that persistent stratification events. And so we'll try to capture those both with and without freshwater inflows when there's a high tidal amplitude and low tidal amplitude. If it's easy, we'll probably just replicate that for 365 days in two years in a row. But that was one question I had for you, is like, how realistic is that? Like, do you have ship traffic every day? Can we just replicate something like that?
Yeah, I mean, so if you can go back to the box plots for a second,
Sorry, this one?
yeah, I mean, so the mean draft to me, is probably, I understand how that would be derived, but I think it's probably skewed shallow.
Okay.
Because the problem with using the mean here is that, it's really there's clear polarity in the data. Coming in empty is very shallow. Going out fully laden is almost always gonna be kind of in the more mid 40-foot depth or deeper.
Okay.
For the vessels that we wanna model. And then the temporal distribution, you have to be very careful, I think, to avoid averaging out those transits across the year because it's extremely heterogeneous. I mean, there can be periods of hours, days with no large vessel traffic, and then you can have convoys that, in the course of an hour are multiple vessels. So, whether mean or median, or whether you just want to pick representative classes that sort of represent kind of the extremes of mixing, I'm not sure whether using mean makes sense, right?
Okay, so maybe like a large ship scenario and a small ship scenario, and try to bound it a little bit.
Yeah, because I think it's a better representation of sort of the reality of the divergence of the data, right? It's not a smooth curve in terms of draft. But I think doing a single vessel and then sort of talk about how you would extrapolate temporally and how frequently that happens, because the limiting factor is what is the longest period between transits. That's what really matters, because that's when you would have quote unquote worst case conditions, right? Because you have zero mechanical mixing.
Yeah, I mean, right now we're simulating the worst case, right? We have zero mixing from ship traffic, so we're already doing that. So this is more if there is ship traffic, how much does it mitigate potential onset of
So I think to the extent you're modeling a single vessel loaded, I would suggest a deeper draft.
Okay, so deeper draft, maybe a larger ship with a deeper draft.
Call it in somewhere between 35 and 45 feet of draft, probably is a better representation of
I would suggest that you need to do barges and ships separately. The barges are much more frequent, almost an order of magnitude higher than the ships. And they're gonna have different impacts, but barges are continuous, they're every day, multiple barges.
And we talk about this a lot, so not to belabor it, but when it's a matter of barges, it's a tug prop phenomenon in some upper portion of the water column. When it's vessels, it's truly a displacement phenomenon that dwarfs the signal of the accessory tugs that are assisting them.
Yeah.
Right. So it is from a hydrologic standpoint, completely different mechanical phenomenon.
Yeah, I think so. And that's the important point is like, when you have a tug, it mixes primarily the surface water. It's not going to have as much effect on a deeper stratification, right?
So there's a lot of, there's nuance here. I mean, tugs
that
move.
That isn't really true.
Okay.
But it may be more true for tugs moving barges. Tugs moving vessels, you do get full water column mixing, but you're already getting that from displacement from the vessel, right?
From the vessel
because
itself,
they're working harder moving vessels in different directions. So,
I mean, like the more we dug into it, it's like, oh, this is like a whole universe of options. It was really challenging to narrow it down. And so we'll definitely look for some guidance here. Is like if you have specific guidance on like, this is probably a good representative.
Just give me a call. That's okay. When you're ready.
Yeah.
Could you go back to that slide where we have vessels, all of them, how many's coming in and out?
Oh, okay, yeah. This one?
No, one more. That one. On your calculations, are you calculating the vessel coming in only, or are you doubling that because the vessel has to come and go on the same path?
Yeah, so
it should be 10,000.
Right.
Not 1,700. Yeah, because it moves. It doesn't go out another way. It comes right back.
Comes back, exactly, yeah. So this is just one way, you're right. So for,
in 10,000 or double the amount every time you have that vessel in the ship channel. So it doesn't go out another direction. It has to model back and come back, so you have triple the movement.
Yeah, and it seems, and my colleague, if he's online, he can chime in here, he's the one who's looked into this data in detail. They don't always go in the same path either, right? So they go make different stops within the harbor, some of them, and
Yes, but it's a diminutive part of the total movement.
okay, so
right? I mean,
the majority movement is just along the
Yeah,
channel.
and it would be unusual for one to go deeper, right? It may stop to lay berth on its way out, but it's still the same net pathway, right? Same
Yeah.
net distance,
Yeah.
just multiple movements. I mean, but that's not the first principle component here, and I would not worry about.
Okay, so just stick to like the main path on the channel, pick a representative large ship and a small ship to bound the problem.
Yeah, I mean, if you
And
guys
it-
get that,
Yeah.
like in the ballpark, I mean, that
Yeah.
seems like it's a stretch as it is. So.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's probably.
Just, I have one point here, it's not on there, but in terms of priority, again, looking at max conditions is, for me, primary interest. This will make it better, but one of the things I was concerned about is that we had conditions recently, I think you shared with me, you were at 50 parts per thousand out here, and I just wanted to dig into that a little bit, that have we looked at those conditions? I mean, in this kind of study, we've been looking at, mid-30s and so forth, and have we captured, in doing this study, the worst case condition? I know we've been in drought, but this is that time frame. But this isn't now. Is there something worse that we're still not picking up with the more recent conditions? This is 23, 24. I guess it's kind of to you.
More up to you guys. Do you even have data from 25 that you could run?
I'm actually not tracking. Can you explain, like, in terms of worst case? We are doing the hypothetical worst case scenario.
No, I
which is-
understand, but
so-
there was recently, I think it was a couple meetings ago, you said you'd seen 50 out in Nueces Bay.
That was Kirsten Stanton.
Okay, so that's quite a bit different than the worst case we've been looking at here, is there?
Well, I mean, we can only simulate it for a period of time that where we have data to support it, and we've already projected it out into an environmental scenario, right? I guess I'm trying to see, like, what is there a specific worst case condition that we can frame that we've not looked at? It seems like we did. We've given it some thought and we've come up with the worst case condition.
I guess we haven't captured the condition where we hit 50 out there, and I'm just digging into it. I'm not saying I know something more, other than it was kind of surprising to see a number that high. And I guess I've heard there has been historic times where Nueces Bay has been that high, but if you look at it, we haven't seen that condition in our study here yet.
So I think what Brad is suggesting is, instead of 23, 24, could we bracket, 24, 25, where the drought just gets, precipitously worse? That's, I think, what you're suggesting.
Or maybe, because in the interest of time, instead of trying to gather all this data, maybe we could just gather some of the information from 2025 and use that as initial condition and see if things make a lot of difference.
I was having some idea. I think you're trying to get at what is happening during kind of extreme conditions, even within the time series. So maybe some of these data that you have for like density differences between the bottom and the surface, or salinity difference, you could do box plots. We look at the distribution, like what happens or how often do you have these sorts of events within the 2 years that are already modeled.
Yeah, somehow we've seen this recently, and we haven't captured a condition where Nueces Bay was at 50. Because it matters in terms of fish too, right? Because you got fish that die at 38 or something, so being the model has all been done in this range of 30, 35, we haven't seen the condition.
The model is simulating whatever the boundary conditions are, right? So if the ocean salinity, or actually in South Bird Island, you see some pretty big spikes in salinity too because of evaporation and so on in Laguna Madre, right? So the model simulates evaporation, so all of that is there in the model. And
So do we see a 50 in Nueces Bay?
Well, we don't see that in the data, that's my point. It's like we have continuous salinity data.
Maybe we have 5 minutes left. Can we go to the next step so everyone is clear on what?
I would like to add just a quick, to Aaron's comment. So previously there was some aquatic life work studying done. What we want to do is compile that and we'll send that out to the committee. So there were previous efforts on aquatic life. So we want to make sure, and I think probably all of you have seen part or of it, so we'll just resend it out to the group. I wanted to get that in before I forgot. Thank you.
No, perfect. I just want to make sure that we cover everything and we are all clear on one of the next steps, what to expect next week, and what to expect to close the process. So.
Yeah, so let's just wrap here. So our efforts are actively ongoing, so Jeff will reach out probably the next day or two, because we need to get this correctly set up and we don't have a lot of time. So really appreciate the help on that. So, and then there was a request to do the 2021 flood. That simulation is ongoing. It's really like just two-month period. That's when that flood happened, right? The freshwater event in Oso Creek in Nueces River. I think that's what you were referring to, correct? I want to make sure that I captured the right flood event.
Can you repeat that?
The 2021 flood in your list of scenarios, that was that Nueces and Oso Creek inflow event, right? In 2021, there was a big freshwater, yeah.
Yes, because it could lead to more pronounced stratification.
Yeah. So that simulation, I mean, we're not going to do a whole 2-year simulation for that. We'll just center it around that. We'll start early enough, and then we'll capture the rising and falling limb, and then we'll take it out probably one full spring neap cycle after, so that you have the full event captured. So.
I had a quick question. Earlier you mentioned that on your run for the desal, you're going to use the fully permitted volume. It was like 51.5 million gallons a day. So that's assuming a 40% recovery rate. In the city's application to TCEQ, they also mentioned having a 50% recovery rate, where the outfall would actually be 35.2 million gallons a day, and the intake would be about 15 million gallons a day less. So it's a more concentrated effluent. I was wondering if y'all were planning on including that at all.
As of now, we're doing only the 40% case. That would just trigger a whole additional set of runs.
And CC polymers, I forgot what you said, if you're including that or not.
In the hypothetical worst case, it is included, yes. Yeah.
Wait, so it's not included in the regular with desal discharge?
Well, as a permitted discharge it is, but not as a desal facility, because that's still not operational, right? So whatever your DMR is included in our current condition.
Okay.
But the specific CCP as a desalination facility is included in the hypothetical worst case. So, yeah.
One question, I might have missed it. The dynamic simulation is included for the inner harbor intake and outflow is already included
Correct,
in these
yes.
runs?
Yes, in these runs, yes, it's already included, yeah. And I'm going to the details of that, like there's a lot of nuances. We didn't have time to cover it, but we did that for Barney Davis as well. We did that for the power plant. We did that for American Chrome. CCP in the hypothetical worst case, we did that. And then for the city of Corpus Christi's desal plant for the with desal scenario, yeah.
And would it be possible to get these runs on our hard drive next week so that we could inspect the runs?
Next week is going to be a challenge. What is the?
I mean, we've got, you're going to be working up until you present it on Thursday.
Yeah. I mean, like realistically, yeah, we have to, you know.
Ideally, it'd just be those two main ones without desal and then with desal, and just have them like give a hard drive to the city sounds like you already have them done, right? So you just have to put it on a hard drive? and get
Yeah,
it
we
to-
do, and then we want to make sure that, we're giving you everything you need and we're documenting it, giving proper metadata, and, so you know what was done and how it was done. And so as a modeler, I hate to just receive somebody's files and, people run it and you don't know, you may make some assumptions when you run it and you don't know, like, I was like, oh, you shouldn't have done that because that's not how we did. So it's, as a modeler, it's not a trivial task to run these models. You have to go through a series of steps. And
I was just asking because there's a demo mode where you just open the run and then you're not modeling or running anything, you're just viewing the results. And so that way you can view the results however you choose to, because there's a lot of ways to look at this.
And importantly, to look at the input conditions that we're actually seeing.
Yeah, I think we have to talk to the city about how we make this model available. That it is our deliverable to the city, and then the city owns the model, and it's their decision, right? And for us, it's going to be really challenging to get it out next week. I don't think it's going to be practical for us to be able to give packaged model runs next week, but we will give all of our work to the city with proper documentation and metadata, and that's part of our deliverable. So, and then it's, the city owns the model, and then it's up to them on how they distribute it. So,
cool, thanks.
Yeah.
The question I have for next time we meet, Pradeep, is, okay. The salinity, like I was talking about earlier, built up mainly in the Inner Harbor, and we're not seeing a lot of salinity build up anywhere else. And over a 2-year period, you're seeing that. My question is, if it built up in 2 years this much, how much does it build up in 5 years, and how much does it build up in 10 years? Or does that scale stay the same? Because you're saying that the tides move this salinity that's been raised up in the Inner Harbor in and out. I don't know how that happens, because I live there and I don't see a whole lot of tidal movement. It's really slow. So I was just wondering if we're seeing a 2-year rise, then what happens in 5 or 10 years? That's what I would like to see.
Well,
and you explain how you know that this tide is moving it in and out.
Yeah, I think that's the explanation for it, right? If it is persisting, you will start to see that diverging. And you're not seeing that divergence in the salinity or the density patterns. You're seeing some duration of the event, and then the event dissipates. That's how we know, and that's the evidence from the modeling work that says that you don't have persistently higher stratification with decel. So to me, that's a direct evidence of and the model simulates the physics, right? So that's how we know that the tide is going in and out. And you have the NOAA tidal gauge shows that data too, right? You see the tides, the water levels go up and down. And that's the forcing that moves the water back and forth. It may not, I know when you look at the water, it doesn't seem like, oh, it's not going really fast, and it doesn't, right? So, but if you really, the data tells that yes, that's how tides work. It just moves the water in, and when the tides go back, it moves the water back out. And that's the mixing process, right? That's the physics.
Yeah, but to me, there's just very little current. The tide is not moving a lot, so I don't know how it moves in and out of the Inner Harbor. Now, I'd just like to see, a little more information about that if possible.
Sorry, I know we're over time. I just wanted to point out, and I brought this up with Jordan previously, but we need to have a hydrogeologist talk to y'all about the groundwater budget in accordance to the bay, just because that hasn't been considered at all, but it will be affecting the bay. So if we could sit down with you and Nick, hopefully we can get something on our schedules for a professional with that.
Can we look at calendars after this? I'm still unclear, Jessica, exactly what the concern is. So if we could catch up after this meeting, I know we've had a hard time connecting. I apologize about that, but let's
that
do
would be great. Just because the Gulf Coast aquifer doesn't have any confined sediment, so it is all connected, including all the drawdowns that the city's doing. But I'll let a professional explain that to y'all.
Oh, I disagree with that. There's plenty of confining layers in the Gulf Coast aquifer.
Could I ask a few questions? So, Carrie makes a good point, and it's something that I'm just conceptually struggling with, which is the influence of the tides. You are correct that tides go in and tides go out. In a more macro tidal system, that is definitely the case. But in a system like Corpus Christi Bay, where you have, tides of 0.2 to 0.4, meters and, very long residence time, I still struggle with that. And then, I circle back to some earlier work from the 70s that I think Ned Smith did. He was an oceanographer. And his work seemed to indicate that any tidal influence, it's really dissipated by the time you get up to, Inner Harbor and where Carrie's talking about. So conceptually, I'm still struggling with, that high frequency variability that you're seeing in the data. So I guess what this gets at is also following up on what Jason said, which is that, we've been told we have to accept that there's not going to be any independent peer review of this work. And so I think what I'm asking is, will the city commit to releasing all of the modeling information, including the model inputs, the model parameterization, and everything that somebody would need to actually replicate this work? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah, to Pradeep's point, we just want to make sure that information is clearly presented and all of the information can be utilized. I would think that this would be on a scientific standpoint, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this would be a kickoff to probably further assessments within the Gulf, within the Bay, and other things. There's probably a number of additional studies where, today, the great work that Spheros is doing is focused on Inner Harbor, but as things happen, as there's going to be potentially new desal plans, that this would be a kickoff to all of that. And
sure,
we're absolutely open to that.
Okay, so you are open to releasing all of their modeling outputs?
Yeah, what we've got to do, and I'm not a modeler, I don't, and Brad's got good insight into modeling all the data. We want to make sure it's done appropriately instead of giving out just a slice of the data and not all of it.
Yeah.
Things
I mean,
like that. Right.
as our deliverable, we'll give all our inputs and outputs to the city. We'll have a metadata saying, here is the base case scenario. Here is the hypothetical worst case scenario. So you will have we'll make all of that available to the city, right? But it's not mine to give you.
Yeah,
the
no,
city,
that's why I'm directing my question to Nick.
So,
the city is committing to releasing all of that information that will be shared from Spheros?
Yeah, right. All I'm saying is we need to make sure it's in a good format and a good package for you. And that's going to be his job.
Right.
To do that.
We have to document it properly so that anybody who picks it up, I mean, in future, if the city we're building a tool for the city, they might choose to use it in future, right? And whoever picks it up should be able to run it independently.
Yeah,
reproduce
totally
results.
get that. But so what I'm saying is, when this project is fully done, the contract is met, Jason or I or whomever can just reach out to you, Nick, and say, please share that modeling information?
Yeah, it can be to me or it can be anybody else, but I mean, we're not, absolutely, yes.
Can you just send the content that you presented today as soon as possible so we have some time to look it over before next week? I mean, this is for the city, right? We usually get the PowerPoint presentations. Just try to send it this week so we have some time.
So this one's a tricky one because it gets all the links in there. So we have to, we have it, but we just make sure that it's not
in
just
a folder.
You need the folder that goes with it to have all the information. I can provide that to you, Katya.
On Tuesday, there was a question about the vertical resolution of the model in the proposal. It was stated to be increased. Originally in the 2023 model, it was like a meter tall for each layer. Now it's decreased to about 2 meters. Can you explain why that decision was made and why it's still accurate in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I want to reiterate that this is not a near field model. This is a far field model, right? So the goal of this model is to give us a long enough simulation to assess far field effects and effects that persist over time. And by reducing the resolution, we are actually limiting our, all of these would not have been possible if it was a 20-layer model, in the time frame that we had. So, and having said that, I think 10 10 layers is not necessarily poorly resolved. As you saw in a lot of the pictures, you do get the stratification, you capture that, we are matching the data extremely well. So the model is accurate for the intended use for which we're building it. So that is really just our professional judgment call that we made to deliver what we need to deliver.
So would a 3-meter layer height still be accurate in your opinion?
Well, we've not tried a 3-meter layer, right? The model validation would be the proof of that.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure whatever y'all decided, it could be somehow demonstrated that this is like the Goldilocks resolution where it's not wasting computational time, but still is giving us very accurate results. If possible, just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, you can always increase, like I said, we had this conversation came up earlier in this too. You can infinitely increase the resolution. That's going to make your model more precise. Doesn't mean it makes your model more accurate.
Right.
And you know this very well as a modeler, right? The smaller you go, your Quran condition is going to really limit how fast you can run the model, right? And so there are all these numerical issues too that you have to deal with, and model stability and so on. And so you have to optimize it to some level. And so I think, 2 meters seemed appropriate here, and it seemed to work well, and model is stable. It produced very good calibration, as you saw. And so that was the basis for us sticking to what we did. To your question of can you do a 20-layer model? We can. That's not, certainly we could do it. It's just, can we do it before next week? And we're going to try to see if there is anything we can do. The challenge with changing the vertical resolution right now is that you have to go back and rejig all your point sources to match the layers and elevations. And, so the question is where do we spend our time?
Right.
And to me, if the model was inaccurate, it was not capturing some of the stratification events that would warrant that investigation. But I'm not seeing evidence for.
I guess my concern is that it might hide the persistence of longer periods of stratification because the resolution isn't high enough.
Can you explain that a little bit more? How would it hide it?
Because I guess the idea is if the chunks are really big and as a plume kind of decreases in size, wouldn't it sort of average out as it keeps?
I mean, the city already did a core mix modeling study, right, to look at exactly how it mixes with the diffuser porch and the momentum and everything.
Right.
And so the reality of it is that, the way I understand it, at the edge of the mixing zone, they're already pretty well mixed. There's not really, the diffusers are doing their job of mixing it. That's a near field study that you're talking about, right? But once that salt is in, then the question is, that salt load, how does that propagate through a big tidal estuarine system? This model is suitable for that question.
Okay, so Texas Parks and Wildlife released a study in 2018 about marine discharges, and they made a recommendation that at a minimum, each evaluation for a desal plant should look at the potential for depressed oxygen levels due to poorly dispersed brine discharges at a particular location. Do you think this kind of meets that, where basically answers whether or not there will be low DO events from poor dispersion?
I think at the resolution at which it is built, you're able to tell whether there is a risk of stratification persisting in some set of locations or not, right? And you're seeing that in the channel, it is persisting, and it is giving you that information. Cool. And to me, it is answering the question that was posed to the model, right? The question is it persisting in 0.5 meter increment versus 2 meter increments is what you're getting at, right? And how important is that to answer that versus is it a risk or not? I think we've answered that first question already with the current resolution, right? Okay. Do you need to get more precise about it? And does that add value is what I'm trying to get at. To me, it doesn't add that much value unless you're really specifically interested in okay, there is a particular habitat at this depth resolution, then yes, you would increase the resolution of this model and address that's a very specific scientific question you're looking to answer right at that point.
Yeah, I guess the thing is we were trying to identify potential low DO hotspots. And so I just had the concern that decreasing the resolution sort of made it harder to do that possibly. And so I just wanted to hear that explanation, which I think you gave.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like, it's identified that, yes, it persists. It persists at least over a spring leap cycle, right? And then even when you have like a fully resolved model, you're probably going to see or in a more finely resolved model, you'll still see something similar. It might, like, again, it's a matter of precision at that point, right? Numerical precision is like, it's going to say like, it's a sharper front here at this depth interval. And that's what you're losing. But to me, like, we've already answered the question that was posed to the model.
So while we're 15 minutes over time, and out of respect to the committee and everyone's schedule, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Katya.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I understand.
One more question, just real quick.
I would prefer to close it down, and maybe we can go offline with Pradeep or send him an email.
It's a follow-up to what Jason basically said.
Let's let.
Let's keep it very.
Mike, one more question, Mike, and then we'll move on. I still want to catch up.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so basically, I think what Jason's trying to get at is, and I'll try and demonstrate, is I'm 2 meters, right? So natural hypoxia in Corpus Christi Bay is usually down here. So if you're taking the average all the way through this water column, you're going to be missing and blurring out whatever is happening there with that low oxygen water. So then aside from that, you've got oyster reefs, which are probably going to be down in here, but your model is like, it's taking this whole water column, so you're not seeing what's happening at the level of the oysters. The flounder, they're living down here on the bottom. So again, this 6 meter, or this 2 meter, 6 foot resolution, you're missing a lot of the relevant processes, whether it's stratification or, in this case, we're not even doing dissolved oxygen, because that's all happening down here, and this model is just kind of taking an average of that whole column there. So I think that's what Jason's kind of getting at, right?
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I respect that, but what I'm saying is another model to answer that question was previously built in the harbor with the very fine resolution, right? So.
Right, and it's only the first 500 feet. And it did show a 5 meter plume that persisted for 3 kilometers. And so we were hoping the far field model wouldn't do near field modeling, but would answer, is there persistent stratification past that 500 feet? And if so, is it long enough to create hypoxic conditions?
Which it did show, right? Like you saw in ship channel 1 and ship channel 2 locations, you're seeing a difference in stratification. So it's already answered that question, right? So from a biological perspective, like, does it change the stratification potential? Yes, it does in the channel. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at. It's like, you can increase the resolution, you probably come to the same conclusion. And I don't think it'll be that different.
Remember also that the inner harbor process absolutely increases the amount of oxygen.
It supersaturates it,
There's
right?
a dissolved air flotation. So the effluent at the point of the sparger has significantly more oxygen in it than the water had when you took it out of the ship channel.
Right.
You are increasing the oxygen concentration. You're not diminishing it, you're increasing it.
Right, so it gets a head start, but it still has the potential to run out due to the lid that Hertzko was talking about earlier.
But it's going to run out significantly differently because of the inject of the extra oxygen.
Could take longer, yeah.
I appreciate you bringing that up, Roger. That's something that we forget to talk about, but that's an absolute fact in the design. Yeah. Okay, let's thank you all for your time today. Go ahead.
Close it up. We just want to thank you, everyone, for your time, your patience, and all your inputs today. Again, you can keep communicating via email. We'll be taking care of that. I'll coordinate with Pradeep to share the information and the materials. And next Thursday, in a week's time, you will be able to see these next steps and discuss the closing of the modeling. Thank you so much.